Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of Victorian England's darkest secrets, a world where being poor, hungry or simply unlucky could get a little girl locked away for years. Imagine being 8 years old, stealing a single loaf of bread because your stomach aches with hunger, and finding yourself sentenced not to a warning, not to a fine, but to 5 years of what society called education. 5 years for bread. Tonight, we're going to explore what really happened behind the doors of Victorian reformatory schools for girls, where love and violence walked hand in hand, where saving children somehow meant breaking them first. So before we step into this strange history together, I want to ask you something. If you enjoy these journeys through time with me, would you take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and maybe hit that like button? But only if you genuinely find value in what we explore here. I never want you to feel obligated, and I'm always curious. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Tucked in bed in New York? Driving through somewhere quiet in the Midwest? Taking a late night walk in Seattle? Drop a comment and let me know. I love knowing where these stories find you. Now, dim those lights if you can, get comfortable. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Let's walk together through the cobblestone streets of 1850s England, where tonight's story begins. Picture London in the year 1846. Not the London of grand balls and glittering chandeliers you might see in period dramas, but the other London, the one most people preferred to ignore. Walk with me down the narrow alleyways near the Thames, where the air hangs thick with the smell of sewage and factory smoke. The buildings lean together like they're too tired to stand up straight on their own. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are children. Not the children of wealthy families, mind you. These are the children that Victorian society called street Arabs, a term that somehow made it easier to look away from their suffering. Little girls no older than 7 or 8, their faces smudged with dirt, wearing dresses so thin you could practically see through them, wandering the streets with bare feet even in winter, no shoes, no stockings. Some of them, according to records from the time, had no shirts beneath their ragged outer clothes, no homes, sleeping on casks on the quay or huddled on steps, trying to find some corner that blocked the wind. Now here's where it gets interesting, in that particularly Victorian way that makes your heart sink. These children, hungry, desperate, cold, they had to eat somehow, they had to survive. So they did what any of us might do when faced with starvation. They took things, a loaf of bread from a baker's window, an apple from a cart, a pair of boots from outside a shop because frostbite was real and winter was cruel. And Victorian England? Victorian England decided that this fundamental act of survival was a crime worthy of serious punishment. Let me share with you a real case from the Leeds reformatory schools, because sometimes the actual facts hit harder than any story I could invent. There was a girl, we will call her Sarah, because her first name has been lost to history, but her crime has not. Sarah was 9 years old. 9. She stole a handkerchief. 1 handkerchief. Perhaps she thought she could sell it for a penny or two, enough to buy some food. Perhaps she just wanted something clean and pretty in a life that offered neither. It did not matter. She was arrested, tried in the same court where adult criminals stood, and sentenced to 5 years in a reformatory school. 5 years. Let that sink in for a moment. If you're listening to this and you have a 9-year-old in your life, imagine them being taken away for 5 years. Imagine them being gone until they're 14 for a handkerchief. And Sarah was not unusual. The records from reformatory schools across England tell us that the vast majority of girls sent away, we are talking about 70, maybe 80%, were sentenced for theft. But not grand larceny, not elaborate schemes. They stole food, they stole clothes, they stole boots, small amounts of money, maybe a few shillings that had been left unattended. According to the archives from the Leeds Industrial School for Boys and the Thorpe Park Industrial School for Girls, children could be committed to these institutions for up to 5 years, or in some cases, until they reached the age of 16. The crimes? Stealing, yes, but also vagrancy, which is just a fancy word for being homeless, and begging. Read that again. Being homeless was a criminal offence in 19th century England. If you were a child and you had nowhere to go, that in itself could get you locked up. Here is something that might surprise you though, and it surprised me too when I first discovered it in the historical records. The reformatory schools were actually considered progressive for their time, revolutionary even. Because before they existed, you know what happened to these children? They went to adult prison. Full stop. Let me paint you a picture of what that meant. In the early 1800s, a child who stole food would be tried in the same court as adult murderers and thieves. They could be sentenced to time in a local prison, and we are talking about prisons that make modern jails look like resorts. Dark, damp cells, no sanitation, disease running rampant, prisoners of all ages mixed together. Or worse, they could be sentenced to a prison hulk. These were old, rotting ships anchored in harbours, converted into floating nightmares of confinement. The Captivity, for example. This was a prison hulk moored in England that housed boys from 1824 to 1826. Imagine being 10 years old on a creaking, decrepit ship surrounded by hardened criminals, the smell of decay mixing with the salt air. Some children were even sentenced to transportation, shipped off to Australia for crimes as minor as stealing a loaf of bread, separated from everything they had ever known by thousands of miles of ocean. So when reformers in the 1830s and 1840s started saying, hey, maybe we should not put children in prison with adult criminals, it actually was a progress. Wild, right? The bar was so low it was practically underground. But here is where the story gets complicated, because this is where good intentions and terrible execution start their awkward dance together. See, these reformers, earnest, well-meaning people who genuinely believed they were saving children, they looked at these poor girls on the streets and they saw a very specific kind of danger. Not the danger the girls were actually facing, like starvation or illness or violence. No, they saw moral danger. Victorian society, and particularly the middle and upper classes who had the time and money to worry about such things, they were experiencing what we might call today a full-blown moral panic about juvenile delinquency. The newspapers were full of it. Penny dreadfuls, those cheap, sensational publications, ran lurid stories about child criminals forming gangs, corrupting each other, threatening the very fabric of civilized society. Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist in 1837, and suddenly everyone was terrified of child pickpockets operating in organised rings. In 1816, Parliament actually set up an entire committee dedicated to investigating what they called the alarming increase in juvenile crime in the metropolis. Alarming increase. But here is a question worth asking. Was juvenile crime actually increasing? Or were children simply more visible now that they were crowding into cities instead of being spread out across rural areas where they could work as bird scarers or stone gatherers? Think about it. Before the Industrial Revolution, a poor child in the countryside could make a few pennies doing odd jobs around farms. They had a place in the rural economy, even if it was a meagre one. But in cities like London, Bristol, Manchester, industrial cities built on factories and commerce, what could a penniless child do? There were no birds to scare, no stones to gather. There was just the street and hunger and the desperate mathematics of survival. So yes, children were very visible on the streets. And Victorian society, with its particular obsession with order and propriety and moral cleanliness, found this visibility deeply uncomfortable. These children reminded respectable people of everything they wanted to pretend did not exist: poverty, suffering, the grinding machinery of industrial capitalism that enriched some while crushing others. And this is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective, because the Juvenile Offences Act of 1846 officially recognised that children under 14 should be tried in special courts, separate from adults. Progress, right? Except the definition of what made a child a juvenile offender was breathtakingly broad. A girl could be sent to a reformatory school not just for stealing, but for being what they called incorrigible, which basically meant difficult to control, or for being found in the company of thieves, even if she herself had stolen nothing, or for having parents who were considered unfit, or for simply being neglected. Let me give you a real example from the records. There was a case of an 8-year-old girl, 8 years old, who was committed to a reformatory because her mother had been sent to prison. Not because the girl had done anything wrong, not because she had stolen or begged or caused any trouble, simply because her mother was incarcerated, and therefore the child was considered at risk of becoming criminal herself. So they took her away and locked her up in an institution until she was 16, 8 years, for having an imprisoned parent. Now I want you to think about what this means. Victorian England was essentially criminalising poverty and misfortune. If your family was struggling, if your parents could not feed you, if circumstances forced you onto the streets, the solution was not to help your family or address the systemic poverty that made survival so difficult. The solution was to take you away from your family and put you in an institution designed to reshape you into something society found more acceptable. And here is another layer to this whole situation. The reformatory schools did not just appear out of nowhere. They were the product of very specific legislation passed in 1854, the Youthful Offenders Act, also called the Reformatory Schools Act, and the Industrial Schools Act that followed in 1857. These acts created two types of institutions. Reformatory schools were for children who had been convicted of actual crimes, theft, assault, vandalism, what have you. Industrial schools were technically for children who needed protection. Orphans, children of imprisoned parents, children found begging or wandering the streets. In theory, there was a clear distinction. In practice, the line got blurry real fast. Older children tended to end up in reformatories, younger ones in industrial schools, with very little regard for the actual circumstances that brought them there. And here is the kicker. Before a child could even enter a reformatory school, they had to serve 14 days in an adult prison first. 14 days. As what? Punishment? A deterrent? A little taste of what awaited them if they did not reform. The reasoning gets murky, but the trauma. That was crystal clear. Can you imagine being a 10-year-old girl who stole some bread sitting in a prison cell for 2 weeks, surrounded by the sounds of adult criminals, before being transferred to what was supposed to be a place of reform and rehabilitation? What message does that send? What does that do to a child's mind? The records from the time tell us something fascinating, though. When children arrived at reformatory schools after their 14 days in prison, after their trials and sentencing, after being torn away from whatever family or community they had, they were often in terrible physical condition, malnourished, sick, covered in lice. Some had diseases we rarely see today in developed countries. Rickets, tuberculosis, infections that came from living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. And here is where the Victorian reformers genuinely believed they were doing good. Because reformatory schools offered something these children rarely had access to: regular meals, simple food, yes, bread, porridge, vegetables, a bit of meat now and then, but regular. The conditions were clean, or at least cleaner than the slums. Medical care was available, and there was free education. basic reading and writing and arithmetic that poor children otherwise would never receive. One report from the time noted that the death rate among poor children in reformatory schools was actually lower than among their peers on the streets. The success rate was described as high, though we will talk more about how they measured success in later parts of our story. But on paper it looked like these institutions were saving lives. Except here is what the numbers and the official reports do not tell you. They do not tell you about the fear, the loneliness, the homesickness, the children who cried themselves to sleep in dormitories full of strangers, missing mothers who could not feed them but loved them nonetheless. The psychological cost of being labelled a criminal before you even understood what that word meant. And they definitely do not tell you about the girls. Because while both boys and girls ended up in reformatory and industrial schools, Victorian society had very particular ideas about what was wrong with girls and what needed to be done to fix them. Ideas that went way beyond teaching them not to steal. See, when a boy stole something, Victorian reformers saw a child who needed to learn a trade, acquire discipline, develop moral character. When a girl stole something, they saw something far more sinister. They saw potential moral corruption. They saw future fallen women. They saw threats to the entire social order that depended on women being pure, obedient, domestic, and above all, sexually virtuous. So the reformatory schools for girls were not just about stopping them from stealing. They were about reshaping these girls into very specific kinds of women. The kind of women Victorian society wanted. Quiet, submissive, skilled in domestic labour, and absolutely, positively free from any hint of sexual knowledge or desire. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and troubling figures in this whole story. A woman named Mary Carpenter, born in Exeter in 1807, daughter of a Unitarian minister, teacher, writer, social reformer, and the founder of the first reformatory school exclusively for girls in all of England. Mary Carpenter believed with her whole heart that she was saving these children. She wrote books about it, she gave speeches, she lobbied Parliament. She dedicated her entire life to the cause of juvenile reform. And yet, when you read her private diaries, when you look at the actual records of what happened in the institution she created, you find something complicated and uncomfortable. You find love mixed with control, compassion tangled up with violence, good intention paving a road to some very dark places. But that is a story for our next part. For now, just remember this. In the middle of the 19th century, in one of the wealthiest, most powerful empires the world had ever seen, being a poor, hungry child was essentially a crime. And the punishment was not prison, not anymore. The punishment was something they called salvation, which, as we will discover, could be far more devastating than any cell. But take a deep breath. Let that settle in. Because next, we are going to step through the doors of Red Lodge in Bristol, where Mary Carpenter's vision of reform took physical form. We are going to meet the girls she called wicked and refractory, and we're going to ask some hard questions about who was really being protected and from what. The story gets stranger, more complex, and yes, more disturbing from here. But it is also a story that needs to be told, because these girls, these children whose names were barely recorded, whose voices were almost never heard, they deserve to be remembered. Stay with me. Now, to understand what really happened to these girls in reformatory schools, we need to talk about something that Victorian society was absolutely obsessed with but pretended not to think about at all. Sex, or more specifically, female sexuality. And I know, when you think Victorian era, you probably think of people being so repressed they covered piano legs because they look too suggestive, right? But here is the thing that history often gets wrong. The Victorians were not actually as sexually repressed as we have been led to believe. They were just incredibly, ruthlessly selective about who was allowed to have sexual feelings and who was not. Let me introduce you to a concept that dominated Victorian thinking about women. It was called The Angel in the House, and it was based on a narrative poem published between 1854 and 1862 by a man named Coventry Patmore. This poem described the perfect Victorian woman, and let me tell you, she was something else. According to this ideal, a proper woman was pure, selfless, submissive, emotionally sensitive, intellectually weak. Yes, weak intelligence was considered a virtue, and here is the important part: completely free of sexual desire. Can you imagine? Being told that your worth as a woman depends partly on not wanting sex, not even thinking about sex, not having any sexual feelings whatsoever? One Victorian doctor, a guy named William Acton, actually wrote in his medical textbooks, and these were books that doctors studied and believed. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "The majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind, happily for them." He genuinely thought women were lucky not to have sexual desires. And this was not some fringe opinion. This was mainstream medical doctrine. This is what respectable society believed, or at least claimed to believe. Now, if you were a middle-class or upper-class woman, this ideology meant your education focused on what they called accomplishments. Not math or science or history. Heaven forbid a woman develop her intellect too much. No, accomplishments meant things like drawing flowers, embroidering, playing the piano, speaking a little French, maybe doing some light watercolours. Skills designed to make you attractive to a potential husband, but not so educated that you might have opinions of your own. There were actual instruction manuals for this. Books like Bowles's Drawing Book for Ladies that taught young women how to sketch and embroider flowers, because apparently that was the height of feminine achievement. The goal was not to prepare you for independence or a career. The goal was to turn you into what they called an angel in the house, a beautiful, obedient, morally pure ornament in your future husband's home. And here is where it gets really twisted. Victorian society believed that women were physically weaker than men, which, okay, on average, there are some biological differences in muscle mass, sure, but they took this physical difference and turned it into this whole ideology about women being morally superior to men. Physically weak but spiritually strong, your job as a woman was to stay in the domestic sphere and be the moral conscience of your family. You were supposed to counterbalance all the dirty, corrupt business your husband had to deal with in the public world of commerce and politics. The home was supposed to be this pure, sacred space, and you were the guardian of that purity, which sounds kind of nice until you realize what it actually meant. You had no power in the public sphere, no legal rights, no economic independence. But hey, at least you got to be morally superior while being completely dependent on men for everything. If you got married, and let me be clear, marriage was pretty much the only acceptable path for a respectable woman. Everything you owned became your husband's property. I mean everything. Money you inherited? His. Jewelry your grandmother left you? His. Income from any property you brought to the marriage? His. You could not even give away your own possessions without his permission. It was not until 1870, with the Married Woman's Property Act, that women could even keep their own earnings after marriage. And it took another act in 1882 before married women could retain property they owned before getting married. Think about that timeline. We are talking about the same era as reformatory schools, the same society that claimed to be saving poor girls, but married women of all classes could not legally own their own property. And then there was this absolutely fascinating contradiction about marriage itself. Young middle-class women were expected to want marriage desperately because what else could they do? But they were not supposed to want it for the wrong reasons. Being too eager to find a husband suggested you might have, gasp, sexual desires. One conduct manual from the time warned that being forward in the company of men suggested a worrying sexual appetite. So you were supposed to want to get married but not be too obvious about it. You were supposed to attract a husband but remain passive and modest. You were supposed to become a mother, the highest calling for any woman, but you were expected to desire marriage because it allowed you to become a mother, not because you wanted sexual or emotional satisfaction from a relationship. Do you see how impossible this was? How many contradictions a woman had to navigate just to be considered respectable? And here is where things get really dark. Because all of this, all these rules about purity and domesticity and sexual innocence, all of this applied only if you were middle class or upper class, only if you were already respectable. If you were poor, if you were working class, if you ended up in a reformatory school, well, different rules applied to you. Poor women were assumed to be less pure, more vulnerable to moral corruption, more likely to fall into sexual sin. Why? Not because of anything they actually did, but because poverty itself was seen as a kind of moral failing. If you were poor, Victorian society figured there must be something wrong with your character. And if there was something wrong with your character, you were probably already on the path to becoming what they called a fallen woman. Now, a fallen woman, and yes, they really used that term, was any woman who had engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage. Could be a prostitute, could be a woman who had a baby out of wedlock, could even just be a woman who was seen spending time alone with men in circumstances that seemed suspicious. Once you were labelled as fallen, society basically considered you beyond redemption. You were ruined. Damaged goods. Victorian literature is full of stories about fallen women, and let me tell you, things did not end well for them. Anna Karenina throws herself under a train. Madame Bovary, poison. Tess of the d'Urbervilles, executed. The message was crystal clear. If you stray from the path of sexual purity, death is the only appropriate ending to your story. But here is the really messed up part. While women were expected to be pure and chaste and completely disinterested in sex, men were given a completely different set of rules. Wealthy Victorian men regularly visited prostitutes. They kept mistresses. They had affairs. Some had entire second families that everyone politely pretended not to know about. And this was just accepted as normal male behaviour. There was actually a phrase for this, the sexual double standard. Women had to be virgins before marriage and faithful during it. Men? Well, boys will be boys, right? Men were understood to have sexual needs that required satisfaction. Women having those same needs? Unthinkable, unnatural. A sign of moral degeneracy. This hypocrisy reached peak absurdity with something called the Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in the 1860s. These laws, and I want you to really hear this, these laws allowed police in certain towns to arrest any woman they suspected of being a prostitute and force her to undergo a medical examination for venereal diseases. Any woman. Based on suspicion alone. If she was found to be infected, she could be locked up in what they called a lock hospital until she was cured. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that is horrific, but at least they were trying to control disease, right? Except here is the thing, the laws only applied to women. The male customers who were spreading these diseases just as much as the prostitutes, they faced no consequences whatsoever. They were not examined, they were not arrested, they were not locked in hospitals. A woman named Josephine Butler, we will talk more about her later, she campaigned vigorously against these acts. She pointed out the obvious injustice. Why were only women being punished for sexual activity that involved men? She said, and this is powerful, she said it was always men, only men from first to last. Men purchased sex from women. Men fleeced women. Men examined women. Men imprisoned women. And men walked away free. The Contagious Diseases Acts were not repealed until 1886 after decades of protest. But the mentality behind them, the idea that female sexuality needed to be controlled, monitored and punished, that mentality ran deep in Victorian society, and it shaped everything about how reformatory schools treated girls. See, when Victorian reformers looked at poor girls, especially girls who had been on the streets, they saw potential fallen women. They saw girls who'd been exposed to what they called vice, girls who might have seen things, heard things, maybe even experienced things that threatened their sexual innocence. And this terrified Victorian society more than the girls' poverty, more than their hunger, more than any actual crime they might have committed. Let me give you a real example. In the records from various reformatory schools, you will find girls admitted not because they stole anything, but because they were found in the company of thieves, or frequenting places of bad repute, or my personal favourite, exposed to moral danger. What does that even mean? It basically meant adults decided this girl might become sexually active if left unsupervised, so better lock her up now as a preventive measure. There is a case from the 1860s of a 14-year-old girl who was sent to a reformatory school because she was seen talking to men on the street, not doing anything with them, just talking. But a respectable woman did not speak to strange men, so clearly she was heading down a dangerous path. 5 years in reform school for having conversations. Another girl, about 15 years old, was committed to an industrial school because she stayed out late at night. Her family was desperately poor, she was probably working or trying to find work, but staying out after dark made her suspect in the eyes of moral reformers. She was considered at risk of prostitution, so into the institution she went. And then there were the teenage girls who actually were prostitutes. Because yes, child prostitution was a massive problem in Victorian England. Girls as young as 12 or 13 selling sex to survive. But instead of asking why society had failed these girls so completely that they had to sell their bodies to eat, Victorian reformers focused on saving the girls from their own supposed moral corruption. Organisations sprang up dedicated to rescuing prostitutes. Charles Dickens himself collaborated with a wealthy philanthropist named Angela Burdett Coutts to set up what they called a Magdalene House, named after Mary Magdalene, the biblical prostitute, which would prepare fallen women for a new life in Australia, as if sending them to the other side of the world would somehow cleanse them of sexual experience. Now here is where this connects directly to our story about reformatory schools. The people running these schools were absolutely convinced that the most important thing they could do for poor girls was protect their sexual purity or restore it if it had been lost. Everything else, education, job training, even basic kindness, came secondary to this overwhelming obsession with controlling these girls' sexuality. Mary Carpenter, the woman we mentioned earlier who founded the first girls' reformatory, she wrote explicitly about this. In her books and diaries, she kept coming back to the idea that girls needed to be prepared for what she called the natural restraints of the home. Natural restraints. As if being constrained was the natural state for women. She believed that wayward girls needed to be domesticated, and yes, that is the actual word she used, the same word you would use for taming a wild animal. They needed to learn their place in the domestic sphere. They needed to internalize the idea that a woman's value came from being a good wife and mother, from being obedient and pure and sexually innocent. And if they had already lost their sexual innocence, well, that had to be scrubbed away somehow, made clean again. Which brings us to one of the most symbolic and disturbing aspects of reformatory school life, the laundry work. Girls in reformatory schools spent hours every day doing laundry for neighbouring families and for boys' reformatories. Back-breaking work, washing clothes by hand in cold water, their fingers going raw from the lye soap. And the reformers who designed this labour genuinely believed it was symbolic. Washing dirty clothes clean was supposed to represent washing away the girls' sins, making them pure again. The daily performance of laundry generated actual profits for the schools. We will talk more about that economic angle later, but it also had this heavy symbolic weight. One historian who studied Victorian reformatories wrote that the idea of wayward girls needing to be domesticated firmly underpinned the philosophy and practice of girls' reform for a century, from the 1850s to the 1950s. An entire century of believing that poor girls' fundamental problem was that they were not domestic enough, not submissive enough, not sexually controlled enough. And the thing is, Victorian society genuinely believed this was kindness. This was mercy. This was salvation. They thought they were saving these girls from lives of degradation and sin. They thought that by teaching girls to scrub floors and wash clothes and sew and cook, by drilling into them the importance of obedience and purity and domesticity, they were giving these girls a chance at respectable lives. But what they were really doing was trying to force working-class girls into a very specific mould shaped by middle-class values. They were saying your poverty is not the problem, your hunger is not the problem, the economic system that created your suffering is not the problem, you are the problem, your character, your morality, your failure to be the right kind of woman, and if you could not or would not fit into that mould, if you were too spirited, too independent, too angry about the injustice of it all, well, that is when the reformatory schools had other methods we will explore in detail as we continue, methods that showed just how thin the line between salvation and punishment really was. For now, just sit with this. In Victorian England, being born female and poor meant navigating a world designed to control your body, your sexuality, your very sense of self. It meant being told that your only value lay in being pure and domestic and obedient, while simultaneously being denied the resources and respect that would make any kind of decent life possible. It meant being saved whether you wanted to be saved or not, and in ways that often looked an awful lot like punishment. And in our next part, we are going to meet the woman at the centre of this whole contradictory mess. Mary Carpenter, brilliant, dedicated, complicated, deeply flawed Mary Carpenter, who genuinely believed love should guide all reform work, and yet whose schools had punishment cells in the basement where girls were locked away in darkness. Stay with me. The story is about to get even more complex. So let me tell you about Mary Carpenter, because if you are going to understand this story, really understand it, you need to know about the woman who stood at the centre of the entire reformatory school movement in England. And Mary Carpenter is fascinating precisely because she cannot be easily categorised as either hero or villain. She was both. She was neither. She was deeply, profoundly human in all the complicated ways that means. Mary Carpenter was born on April 3rd, 1807, in Exeter, England. Her father, Lant Carpenter, was a Unitarian minister. Unitarians were this progressive Christian denomination that believed in reason, education, and social reform. And he also ran a boarding school. Her mother, Anna Penn, was a teacher as well. So Mary grew up in a household where education was valued, where intellectual curiosity was encouraged, where helping others was considered a sacred duty. And here is something I find really interesting. Mary was the eldest child, and for several years she was an only child, which meant she received an extraordinary amount of attention and intellectual stimulation from her highly educated parents. This was unusual for girls at the time. While most Victorian girls were being taught to embroider and play piano, Mary was learning Latin and mathematics and philosophy. She was raised to think, to question, to engage with ideas. But there was a shadow side to this upbringing. Her father, by all accounts, was a brilliant but demanding man. Mary grew up desperate to please him, to live up to his expectations, to prove herself worthy of his approval, and I think this shaped her entire life in ways she probably never fully understood. That need to be good enough to do important work, to save people, it drove her to incredible achievements, but it also maybe drove her to be harder on herself and others than was healthy. When Mary was in her early 20s, she worked as a governess on the Isle of Wight for a while. But in 1829, she came back to Bristol and opened a small school for girls with her mother. Just a modest little school, nothing revolutionary yet. She was good at teaching, patient, dedicated, but something was stirring in her, some sense that she was meant for something bigger. The turning point came in 1833. Mary was out walking with a visitor from America, a man named Dr. Joseph Tuckerman, who was a philanthropist from Boston. They were walking through the streets of Bristol when they saw a small ragged boy running down the street. Just a child, barefoot, dirty, obviously desperately poor. And Tuckerman said something that lodged itself in Mary's mind like a seed. He said, "The boy should be followed to his home and seen after." Such a simple statement, right? But it contained a revolutionary idea for the time, that society had a responsibility to care for poor children, to investigate their circumstances, to help them, not to punish them, not to ignore them, to actually see them and do something. Mary became obsessed. She started seeking out poor children in Bristol, talking to them, learning about their lives. And what she found appalled her. Children living in conditions of unimaginable poverty. Children who had never been to school, who could not read or write, who were learning criminal behaviour simply because it was the only way to survive. She watched children as young as 6 or 7 being arrested, tried as adults, sent to prison, where they were housed with hardened criminals and emerged worse than when they went in. And Mary thought, there has to be a better way. In 1846, she took action. She collected money from her Unitarian friends and community members and opened what was called a ragged school. These were schools for the absolute poorest children, the ones literally dressed in rags, the ones no other institution would touch. She set it up in St. James's Back in a neighbourhood she described as swarming with ragamuffins. Let me read you something her mother wrote about that first day, dated August 7th, 1846. Nearly 20 boys had assembled. The 7 which Mr. Phelps the master had collected brought in a dozen more in the afternoon. It is literally a ragged school. None have shoes or stockings, some have no shirt and no home, sleeping on casks on the quay or on steps and living by petty depredations, but all appear better fed than the children. Can you imagine walking into a classroom full of children who literally have no shoes, some have no shirts, sleeping on the docks, and Mary did not turn them away. She welcomed them, she fed them, she taught them, and she was apparently really good at it. One account from the time said she succeeded in holding the attention of these untamed and poverty-stricken children through her ability and enthusiasm. But running a ragged school, while important, was not enough for Mary, because she noticed that some children were beyond what a day school could help. The ones who had already been arrested, already been to prison, already learned that society saw them as criminals. These were the children that haunted her, the ones the system had already marked as lost causes. So Mary started studying. She read everything she could find about juvenile reform programs in other countries. She visited institutions. She talked to reformers across Europe. And in 1851 she published a book that would change everything. It was called Reformatory Schools for the Children of the Perishing and Dangerous Classes and for Juvenile Offenders. That title alone tells you so much about Victorian thinking, does it not? Perishing and dangerous classes, as if being poor made you both a victim who was perishing and a threat who was dangerous. But the book itself was actually quite revolutionary for its time. Mary argued that children were different from adults, that they could be reformed, that imprisonment only made them worse, and that what they needed was not punishment but education, moral guidance, and what she called love. Love. That word appears over and over in her writings. Love must be the ruling sentiment of all who attempt to influence and guide these children, she wrote. She believed that reformatory schools should be based on the model of a family, should be small enough that each child could receive individual attention, should employ skilled and caring staff. She believed there should be no forced labour. Work should be educational, not exploitative. She believed corporal punishment should be kept to a minimum. She believed recreation and sports were important. On paper, Mary Carpenter's vision was actually pretty progressive. She was arguing against the harsh, punitive approach that dominated Victorian justice. She was saying children deserve compassion, and people listened. Her book was influential. She organised a conference in Birmingham to discuss juvenile reform, and magistrates and politicians and social reformers came from all over England. A parliamentary inquiry was set up. She gave evidence before Parliament. And in 1854, partly because of her advocacy, the Youthful Offenders Act was passed, which officially authorised the establishment of reformatory schools. Mary must have felt like she was winning, like her vision was becoming reality. So she decided to put her ideas into practice herself. In 1852, she opened a reformatory school in Kingswood, in premises that had originally been set up by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. It was for both boys and girls, and apparently that did not work out so well. Mary quickly realised that housing boys and girls together created problems, whether that was actual behavioural issues or just the appearance of impropriety that Victorian society could not tolerate. The records are not entirely clear, but either way, she decided to separate the sexes, and this is where our story really begins. In 1854, with financial support from Lady Byron, yes, the widow of the famous poet Lord Byron, Mary purchased a building called Red Lodge on Park Row in Bristol. It was an Elizabethan mansion that had fallen into disrepair, built way back in 1568, with beautiful oak panelling and ornate fireplaces and a history of wealthy families. And Mary Carpenter turned it into the first reformatory school exclusively for girls in all of England. Red Lodge was officially certified on December the 9th, 1854, to house up to 52 girls who had been sentenced by the courts to detention of up to 5 years. Mary moved into a house right next door and became the resident superintendent. She was 47 years old, unmarried, she never married, dedicating her entire life to her reform work, and she was about to discover that running an actual reformatory was very, very different from writing about one. See, Mary had this beautiful vision of what Red Lodge would be. A loving family environment, girls being gently guided toward moral improvement, education and training provided with kindness and patience, love conquering all. But the girls who came to Red Lodge, they did not fit neatly into Mary's vision. They were angry. They were traumatized. They had been arrested, tried, sentenced, locked in adult prison for 2 weeks, then shipped to this institution run by people they had never met, who talked about loving them while simultaneously imprisoning them. And Mary's journals, her journals are fascinating because they reveal the enormous gap between her ideals and the reality she encountered. Mary kept detailed diaries of the early years at Red Lodge, and they have been preserved in the Bristol archives. Reading them is like watching someone's beautiful theory crash into messy, complicated reality. One of the very first things she writes about is the physical condition of the building when she took it over. Remember, this had been a grand house, but it had been abandoned and neglected. She writes about finding, and I am not making this up, a human foot in an outhouse. A human foot, just sitting there. No explanation of where it came from or whose it was. Can you imagine? You are trying to start this noble reform institution and you find a random human foot in the shed. But beyond that macabre discovery, Mary writes about the challenges of transforming this decaying mansion into a functional school, setting up dormitories, creating a classroom, installing a kitchen large enough to feed 50 girls, and then there are the cells. In the basement of Red Lodge there were cells, dark, isolated spaces where girls could be locked away. Now Mary never called them punishment cells in her initial planning, but that is what they became, and she knew it. In her journals, she writes explicitly about using the cells for violent, refractory and noisy girls. Refractory. That means stubborn, difficult to control, unwilling to submit to authority. So here we have this contradiction at the heart of Mary Carpenter's work. She genuinely believed in love as the foundation of reform, but she also built cells in the basement for girls who would not comply. And the girls? Oh, the girls tested her patience constantly. Mary writes about girls she describes as exhibiting deep wickedness. She makes notes about which cities produce which kinds of problem children. London girls are wicked, Manchester girls are daring and thoroughly acquainted with vice. Welsh girls are low and coarse and profoundly ignorant. You can feel her frustration bleeding through the pages. There is this one incident she writes about involving baby rabbits. Now, if you read a biography of Mary Carpenter written by someone sympathetic to her, and there have been several, they will tell you this sweet story about how kind Mary bought baby rabbits for the girls to play with, showing her gentle nature. But when you actually read the primary sources, the story is different. The girls could only have a rabbit if they had money to buy one themselves. It was not a gift. It was a privilege for girls who somehow had coins to spare, which most of them did not. And there is this girl in the records known only as A. Small. Her first name was not considered important enough to record, apparently. She had been naughty, the records say, some minor misdeed, possibly stealing a bit of bread or entering a room inappropriately. And her punishment? Isolation, bread and water, no rabbit for her. This is the thing about Mary Carpenter that makes her so complicated. She was not a monster. She was not deliberately cruel. She was genuinely trying to help these children. But she was also a product of her time and class. She could not separate helping from controlling. She could not imagine that these girls might not need to be reformed so much as they needed to be fed and housed and treated with basic dignity and respect. She adopted a little girl in 1858, a 5-year-old named Rosanna. Maybe Mary was lonely. Maybe she wanted to prove her theories about love and family worked. But it did not work out. Within a couple of years, Rosanna was gone. The records suggest Mary, at age 51, simply could not handle caring for a small child. Or maybe Rosanna, like so many of the girls at Red Lodge, just did not fit into Mary's vision of what a reformed child should be. Mary also had a brief attempt at living with a companion, a woman named Frances Power Cobb, who was an Irish feminist and anti-vivisectionist activist. Frances came to work at Red Lodge in 1858 and lived with Mary for about a year. But their relationship was apparently turbulent. They argued. They disagreed about how to run the school. Frances left in 1859, and they never reconciled. What does this tell us? I think it tells us that Mary Carpenter, for all her brilliance and dedication, was not great at relationships. She had this vision of how things should be, how children should behave, how reform should work, how love should manifest, and when reality did not match that vision, she struggled. She could write beautifully about the importance of understanding each child's individual needs, but in practice she ran an institution that demanded conformity. And yet, here is the thing. Mary Carpenter changed the world. Her advocacy genuinely did lead to better treatment of juvenile offenders. The reformatory school movement spread across England and then across Europe and America. Her writings influenced prison reform for decades. When she died in June of 1877, her funeral procession was half a mile long. Thousands of people lined the streets of Bristol to pay their respects. Between 60 and 100 children from each of the institutions she had founded — Red Lodge Reformatory, Kingswood Reformatory, the Boys' Industrial School, Park Row Industrial School — they all marched in their uniforms. Public meeting was held to raise money for a memorial, and they raised £2,700, which was a massive amount of money in 1877. There is a memorial to her in Bristol Cathedral. She is remembered as a pioneer, a reformer, someone who dedicated her life to children nobody else cared about. And all of that is true. But it is also true that the institutions she created caused pain, that her vision of love sometimes looked a lot like control, that the gap between what she wrote and what she practiced was wider than she probably ever acknowledged. So was Mary Carpenter a hero or a hypocrite? Was she saving children or harming them? And honestly, I think the answer is yes. Yes to both. She was doing both simultaneously, because she could not escape the limitations of her own worldview, her own class prejudices, her own need to fix and control. Coming up next, we are going to step fully inside Red Lodge itself. We are going to walk through those doors as the first girls did in 1854. We are going to see what they saw, feel what they felt, and understand what daily life was really like in Britain's first reformatory school for girls. And I promise you it is going to make Mary Carpenter's contradictions feel even sharper, because theory is one thing. But the reality of a child's experience, that is something else entirely. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are 11 years old. 2 weeks ago you were on the streets of London, cold and hungry, and you stole an apple from a market stall because your stomach hurt so badly you could not think straight. You were caught, dragged to court. A magistrate in a powdered wig looked down at you from his high bench and pronounced your sentence: 5 years in a reformatory school, but first prison, real prison, adult prison. For 14 days you sat in a cell with stone walls and a bucket in the corner, and the sounds of other prisoners screaming, crying, fighting. You're 11. You've never been away from your family before, even though your family was just your mother and she could barely feed you. You do not understand why stealing one apple means this. You do not understand any of it. And then, on the 15th day, someone comes for you. You are taken out of the prison, your wrists raw from the rough prison dress they made you wear, and you're put in a carriage. They tell you that you are going to a better place. A place where you will be reformed, saved, made into a proper young lady. The carriage winds through Bristol until it stops at the top of Park Row, a fashionable street lined with grand houses, and there, set back from the road, is Red Lodge. This is what you would have seen on October the 10th, 1854, if you'd been one of the very first girls to arrive at Mary Carpenter's reformatory. Let me describe it to you, because the building itself tells such an important part of this story. Red Lodge was, and still is, because it exists today as a museum, an Elizabethan mansion originally built in 1568. We are talking about a house that was almost 300 years old when Mary Carpenter acquired it. It had been constructed for wealthy families, and you can tell. The moment you approach it, you see these tall windows with their diamond-paned glass, the kind that catches the light and makes it dance. There is a formality to the architecture, a statement of status and permanence. When you step through the front door, you enter into a world that must have felt absolutely alien to girls who'd been living on the streets. Because the previous owners, aristocratic families, successful merchants, they had left their mark everywhere. There was the great oak room with its original oak panelling that rose from floor to ceiling, dark and imposing. The ceiling was moulded plaster with intricate designs that would have taken craftsmen months to complete. And the fireplace, oh, this fireplace was something else. It was what they called a double-decker, stacked in 2 tiers, carved with elaborate detail. Can you picture it? You are a girl who's been sleeping on casks at the quay, whose only shelter has been a doorway or maybe a corner behind some market stalls, where the wind did not cut quite so sharply. And now you are standing in a room with oak panels and plaster ceilings and a fireplace that probably cost more than your entire family would earn in a lifetime. Above the entrance to the great oak room, there was an oak internal porch, still there today, carved with the coat of arms of the Young family and the Wadham family, the wealthy people who had originally built this place. Every detail of that building whispered the same message. This was a house for important people. People who mattered, people who belonged to a class so far above yours that you might as well be different species. And I think that was part of the point, actually. Part of what made Red Lodge work as a reformatory, in Mary Carpenter's mind, was the visual reminder of class difference. You were being allowed into a grand house, yes, but you were not there as a guest. You were there to be transformed into the kind of person who could serve people who lived in houses like this. The architecture itself was a form of education in knowing your place. The building had gone through several owners over the centuries. It had been modified and expanded. In the 1730s, new owners had added a grand Georgian staircase, wide and elegant, designed to let ladies in elaborate dresses process up and down with maximum visibility and grace. They had renovated some of the Tudor rooms to look more fashionable for the Georgian era, and then later, in the early 19th century, there had been more changes, but by the time Mary Carpenter acquired it in 1854, Red Lodge had fallen into serious disrepair. Remember that human foot she found in the outhouse? This was not a well-maintained property. It was a faded grandeur house that had seen better days, which actually made it affordable for a reformatory, because nobody who could afford better wanted to live there anymore. Mary's diaries from those first months describe the absolutely frantic work of transforming this decayed mansion into a functioning institution. They had to set up dormitories on the upper floors where the girls would sleep. The small oak room and the bedroom rooms that had once been private chambers for wealthy residents, these became sleeping quarters filled with narrow beds lined up in rows. Can you imagine sleeping in a room that still had remnants of its elegant past? Moulded plaster ceilings above you, but now you're just one of 20 girls packed in together. No privacy, no quiet. They had to create a classroom space for lessons. They had to install industrial laundry equipment because, as we will talk about more later, these girls were going to spend their afternoons washing clothes for paying customers. They had to set up a kitchen large enough to feed 52 girls 3 times a day. The cottage that came with the property, Lady Byron had purchased both the main house and a small cottage next door. That cottage was designated for training girls in domestic service, teaching them how to clean and cook and serve in the kinds of households that employed servants. And then there were the cells. In the basement of Red Lodge there are, and I mean are present tense, because they still exist today if you visit the museum, there are small dark spaces with heavy doors. These were the punishment cells. And Mary Carpenter's diaries make it clear that she knew exactly what they were for. She wrote about using them for girls who were violent, refractory, and noisy. Think about what it means that the very first thing Mary did, when converting this mansion into a reformatory based on the principles of love and family, was to make sure there were cells in the basement where disobedient children could be locked away in the dark. But let us get back to that 11-year-old girl arriving for her first day. You walk into Red Lodge, probably through a side entrance because the grand front entrance was not for the likes of you, and you are immediately confronted with rules. So many rules. Mary Carpenter had written out detailed rules and principles for both the girls and the staff, and these governed every single aspect of life in the reformatory. You would be told what time to wake up, early, probably around 6 in the morning, maybe earlier in summer. You would be told how to dress in the uniform they provided, plain and practical, nothing decorative, nothing that suggested vanity or individual expression. You would be told where to stand, how to walk, when to speak, and when to keep silent. You would be told that you were there to be reformed, to be made into a respectable young woman, and that this would require complete obedience to the staff and absolute commitment to moral improvement. And then you would meet the other girls. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because we actually have records of who some of these early girls were, where they came from, what they had been convicted of. The Bristol archives contain admission registers, case files, and correspondence that give us glimpses into real individual lives. There was a girl admitted in the first year who'd been convicted of stealing 2 shillings, about 24 pence, from her employer. 2 shillings. That was maybe enough to buy a few loaves of bread or a cheap pair of shoes. She was 13 years old and she got 3 years at Red Lodge. Another girl, aged 12, had been found wandering at night. Not stealing, not assaulting anyone, just wandering. But in Victorian society, a 12-year-old girl out at night without a proper adult guardian was considered to be in moral danger. So reformatory it was. 4 years. There was a 14-year-old who had been living in a house that the authorities described as frequented by prostitutes. It is not clear from the records whether she herself was selling sex or just living there because she had nowhere else to go. And honestly, does it matter? She was 14, she was homeless, she was surviving however she could. But Victorian society looked at her and saw moral corruption that needed to be scrubbed away. 5 years. And then there were the girls who had committed what seemed like more serious crimes, at least by Victorian standards. There was a 15-year-old who'd been part of a group that broke into a shop. She was the lookout, not the one who actually took anything, but she was convicted alongside the others. There was a 13-year-old who had repeatedly stolen food from market stalls, had been warned multiple times, had already been sent to prison twice for short sentences that accomplished nothing except traumatizing her more. And finally a magistrate decided reformatory school was the answer. These girls, some of them had never been to school before at all. Some of them could not read or write. Many of them spoke in accents and dialects that marked them immediately as working class, from the poorest neighbourhoods, the kinds of speech that middle-class reformers found offensive to their ears. Mary Carpenter's journals describe her initial assessments of the girls, and honestly, reading these entries is uncomfortable because you can feel her judgment radiating off the page. She writes about girls who are degraded, coarse, ignorant, bold, defiant. She describes behaviours that clearly disturbed her. Girls who swore, who fought with each other, who talked back to staff, who refused to show the proper deference to their betters. But here is what strikes me reading those journals. Mary Carpenter is describing exactly what you would expect from children who've been traumatized, who've been living in survival mode, who have just spent 2 weeks in adult prison and are now locked in an institution against their will. Of course they were defiant. Of course they were angry. Of course they fought and swore and refused to cooperate. But Mary interpreted all of this as evidence of moral corruption that needed to be corrected, rather than as trauma that needed to be healed. The sleeping arrangements must have been strange for these girls. In the dormitories, the beds were arranged in rows, all visible to each other, no privacy whatsoever. This was intentional. Victorian reformers believed that privacy gave children opportunities for what they called self-abuse. They meant masturbation, which was considered a horrific sin that would lead to moral and physical ruin. So the girls slept in rooms where they could be observed, where staff could walk through at any time, where every movement could be monitored. Can you imagine being 11 or 12 years old, going through puberty? your body changing in ways you probably did not fully understand because nobody had explained it to you, and having absolutely zero privacy, not even in sleep. There is this one detail from the records that just breaks my heart. When girls first arrived, many of them were in terrible physical condition. Malnourished, yes, we knew that would be the case, but also covered in lice, suffering from skin infections, some of them with rickets from vitamin D deficiency, some with early-stage tuberculosis. The staff had to basically give each new girl a thorough cleaning, treat whatever medical conditions they could, and get them into the uniform. And the girls often resisted this, not because they wanted to stay dirty or sick, but because having strangers touch them, examine them, strip them of their own clothes, even if those clothes were rags, and force them into institutional uniforms, this was a violation. It was another way they lost control over their own bodies, their own identities. The records mention that some girls cried through this entire first day process. Some fought. Some went silent and compliant in a way that is honestly more disturbing than fighting would have been, because that silence meant they had already learned that resistance was futile, that adults had total power over them, that they were helpless. The building itself must have felt like a maze at first. You had to learn which rooms you were allowed to enter and which were off limits. The Great Oak Room, for example, was used for special occasions, for when important visitors came to inspect the reformatory for examinations and assessments. It was not a place where the girls could just relax. The classroom was for lessons, the laundry room was for work, the dining area was for silent meals eaten at prescribed times, the dormitories were for sleep, supervised and monitored, and the basement was where you went if you misbehaved badly enough. Mary Carpenter's journals mention specific girls being sent to the cells within the first few months of Red Lodge opening. She does not always say what they did to warrant this punishment, but she does note the duration, sometimes a few hours, sometimes overnight, sometimes longer. Imagine being locked in a dark basement cell in a 300-year-old building. The cells are still there today, and they are small and stone and cold even in summer. In winter, they would have been absolutely brutal, but this was framed as being for the girls' own good. This was discipline. This was teaching them that there were consequences for bad behaviour. This was, in Mary's mind, a necessary part of the reforming process. One of the most disorienting things for the new girls must have been the extreme regimentation of time. On the streets, time had been fluid. You woke when hunger or cold woke you. You ate when you could find or steal food. You slept when exhaustion overwhelmed you. There was no schedule, no structure, but there was freedom of a sort, the freedom that comes from having nothing to lose. But at Red Lodge, every hour was accounted for. You woke at the appointed time, you prayed at the appointed time, you ate at the appointed time, you studied, you worked, you exercised, you prayed again, you ate again, you worked again, you went to bed. All at the appointed times, no deviation allowed. This was supposed to teach discipline and order. And maybe for some girls it did provide a sense of stability they had never experienced before. But for others, it must have felt like being buried alive in routine. Every spontaneous impulse crushed. Every individual desire subordinated to the institution's schedule. The certification document for Red Lodge, dated December 9th, 1854, specified that the institution could hold up to 52 girls. That number is specific and interesting. Not 50, not 60, 52. Why? Probably because of the physical space available in the converted mansion. You could fit 52 narrow beds into the dormitories without violating regulations about minimum space per child. You could feed 52 girls with the kitchen facilities they had. 52 was the maximum capacity that allowed the institution to claim it was providing adequate care, while also maximizing the number of girls who could generate income through their labor. Oh yes, we've not talked about that yet, have we? The fact that these girls worked. They worked hard. We will dive deep into that in an upcoming section. But for now, just know that from day one, these girls understood that they were there, not just to be reformed, but to be useful, to earn their keep, to produce value. And the age restrictions tell us something important too. Red Lodge took girls under the age of 14, with a preference for those under 12. They did not keep anyone past age 16. Think about what that means. These were children and young teenagers. The youngest might be 7 or 8 years old. The oldest were 15, maybe just turning 16 when they were released. But here is the thing. A 7-year-old and a 15-year-old are vastly different in terms of development needs and understanding. Yet they were all housed together, all subjected to the same rules, all expected to conform to the same standards. The younger girls must have been terrified by the older, more hardened girls. The older girls must have been frustrated by the crying and neediness of the younger ones. Staff had to manage this entire range of ages and experiences and traumas, all crammed into one institution. Reading through the early records, you get this sense of barely controlled chaos underneath the surface of strict routine. Yes, there were rules. Yes, there was structure. But there were also fights. There were girls who ran away, or tried to, though escaping from Red Lodge was not easy given its location, and the fact that runaway girls had nowhere to go. There were incidents of girls destroying property, refusing to work, screaming and crying through the night. And over all of this presided Mary Carpenter, living right next door, deeply invested in making her vision work, but increasingly frustrated by the reality of the girls she was trying to save. In the months and years ahead, Red Lodge would develop its own culture, its own rhythms, its own terrible little traditions. Girls would learn which staff members were kind and which were cruel. They would figure out which rules could be bent and which infractions brought harsh punishment. They would form alliances and rivalries. They would survive because that is what humans do even in the worst circumstances. But those first days, those first weeks, they must have been absolutely bewildering. Imagine everything you knew being stripped away and replaced with someone else's vision of who you should be. And what comes next? Well, we need to talk about what daily life actually looked like once you were settled into the routine. Because the theory of reform was one thing, but the day-to-day reality of manufacturing proper women out of working-class girls? That is where Mary Carpenter's beautiful principles met the grinding machinery of institutional control. So let us step into a typical day at Red Lodge and see exactly what reformation looked like from the inside. 6 in the morning. A bell rings through the dormitories of Red Lodge, sharp and insistent, shattering whatever dreams the girls might have been having. And I do wonder what they dreamed about. Home, maybe. Even if home had been a cold doorway, freedom, food, or maybe for some of them the dreams had already stopped, replaced by the grey reality of institutional life. But there is no time for wondering. The moment that bell rings, you have to get up. Every girl, no matter how tired, no matter how cold the floor feels on bare feet, no matter how much you just want to pull the thin blanket over your head and disappear. Staff members walk through the dormitories to make sure everyone is awake, and if you are slow to rise, well, that is noted. Everything is noted at Red Lodge. Let me walk you through what a typical day actually looked like, because this is where the abstract idea of reform becomes concrete routine. This is where Mary Carpenter's philosophy of love and family meets the grinding reality of institutional control. And the schedule? Oh, the schedule was everything. After waking, the girls had perhaps 15 or 20 minutes to dress in their uniforms, use the chamber pots, because remember, this is 1850s England, there is no indoor plumbing as we know it today, and make their beds to precise specifications, hospital corners, blankets pulled tight, everything neat and orderly. A poorly made bed could mean demerits in the mark system, which we will talk about more in a moment. Then the first activity of every single day, prayer. The girls would gather in one of the larger rooms, probably the great oak room on special occasions, but more typically in the dining area or a designated assembly space, and they would pray. Morning prayers were not optional. They were not brief. We are talking about readings from the Bible, hymns sung together, prayers for forgiveness and moral improvement and gratitude for the opportunity to be reformed. And I want you to think about what this meant for girls who might not have grown up in religious households, or who practiced different denominations than the strict evangelical Christianity that Red Lodge promoted, or who were just 11 years old and hungry and would rather eat breakfast than sing hymns, but you did not get breakfast until after prayers. Prayers came first, always. Mary Carpenter wrote explicitly that religious instruction was the foundation of all reform work. She believed that moral transformation had to begin with spiritual transformation, and that meant drilling into these girls a very specific version of Christian teaching. Not the blessed are the merciful parts so much as the sin brings punishment parts. Not the radical Jesus who welcomed outcasts so much as the judgmental God who demanded obedience. After morning prayers came breakfast. And what did girls eat at Red Lodge? Well, it was simple, very simple. Porridge usually, made with oats and water, maybe a tiny bit of milk if they were lucky. Bread, always bread. Dense, heavy bread that filled your stomach even if it did not really satisfy. Sometimes there might be a bit of butter or jam, but that was considered a treat, not a daily expectation. Compare this to what these girls had been eating on the streets, which was often nothing, or scraps, or whatever they could steal. And yes, regular meals at predictable times was actually an improvement. The food at Red Lodge was not good, but it was there, every day, 3 times a day, for children who had known real hunger. That mattered. But meal times were also exercises in control. The girls ate in silence, absolutely tense, no talking, no laughing, no complaining about the food. You sat up straight, you used your utensils properly, and for some girls this was the first time they'd ever used a fork and knife instead of just eating with their hands or whatever was available. You ate what you were given. You did not ask for more. You certainly did not leave food on your plate, because wasting food was a sin when so many were starving, never mind that you were given barely enough to begin with. Staff members supervised every meal, watching for infractions. Talking during meals, demerit, eating too quickly, demerit, eating too slowly. Also a demerit, believe it or not. The rules were so numerous and so specific that it was almost impossible not to break some of them, which I think was partly the point. The system needed infractions to justify its punishments. After breakfast came more religious instruction. This might be Bible study, or it might be what they called moral lessons, essentially lectures about sin and virtue and the importance of being a good, obedient, pure young woman. The staff would read from religious texts or from special conduct books written specifically for reforming wayward girls. And then, finally, came what they officially called education. Now here is where things get interesting. Because technically, all reformatory and industrial schools were required by law to provide education. That was part of their certification. They had to teach girls basic literacy and numeracy. But the amount and quality of that education varied wildly, and at Red Lodge it was distinctly limited. Girls learned to read, yes, basic reading of the Bible and simple texts. They learned to write their names and perhaps a simple letter. They learned arithmetic, addition, subtraction, basic sums that would be useful for household accounts, but nothing more complex. Some records suggest they learned a bit of geography and history, though always through the lens of British superiority and Christian morality. But here is the thing. Education took up maybe 2 or 3 hours of the day at most, sometimes less, and it was always the bare minimum, always functional rather than enriching. Nobody at Red Lodge was teaching these girls literature for the pleasure of it. Nobody was encouraging them to develop their minds, to think critically, to question. Compare this to what boys in reformatory schools were learning, and yes, there is a gender difference here that is stark and deliberate. Boys were trained in manual trades, carpentry, tailoring, shoemaking, joinery, skills that, while still working class and labour-intensive, at least represented actual professions, skills that could lead to apprenticeships, to journeyman wages, to some measure of economic independence. Girls learned domestic service. Period. That was the entire vocational training program. How to clean, how to cook, how to sew, how to do laundry, how to serve at tables, how to be invisible and efficient and never ever inconvenient to your employers. Mary Carpenter stated this explicitly in her writings. She wrote, and this is a direct quote, "Girls must be prepared for the natural restraints of the home." Natural restraints. Think about that phrase. She is saying that being restrained, being controlled, being limited to the domestic sphere, this is natural for women. This is what women are meant for, and the job of the reformatory is to prepare girls for accepting these restraints without complaint, without rebellion, without even the thought that things could be different. So after the morning lessons, which remember were minimal and focused entirely on making girls useful rather than educated, came the afternoon work. And this is where the true purpose of reformatory schools reveals itself. Starting around noon or 1 in the afternoon, the girls at Red Lodge did industrial laundry. Let me explain what this actually meant. Because when we hear laundry today, we think about tossing clothes in a machine and walking away. But in the 1850s, laundry was brutal, exhausting physical labour that could destroy your hands and your back and your spirit. The girls washed clothes for neighbouring families who paid the school for this service. They also washed clothes for the boys' reformatory schools in the area. This meant massive amounts of laundry, sheets, shirts, undergarments, towels, everything made of fabric that could get dirty, which in the sooty, grimy, industrial city of Bristol was basically everything. The work involved huge vats of water that had to be heated over fires. You are stirring heavy, wet fabric with wooden paddles. You are scrubbing stubborn stains against washboards until your knuckles are raw. You are using lye soap that burns your skin and leaves your hands red and cracked and painful. And this is not a quick job. This is hours, 4, 5, 6 hours of hard physical labour every single afternoon. Then the clothes have to be wrung out by hand. Imagine twisting heavy wet sheets with your 11-year-old arms, the water dripping everywhere, your muscles screaming. Then they have to be hung to dry, which in the British climate means they might take days. Then they have to be ironed with heavy flat irons heated on stoves, requiring you to hold weights that burn your hands through inadequate cloth protectors. This was justified in multiple ways. First, practically. The school needed money to operate and the laundry work generated actual income. The families and institutions paying for laundry services were essentially paying for child labour, though nobody framed it that way. They called it training. Second, symbolically, Mary Carpenter and other Victorian reformers genuinely believed that washing dirty things clean was a metaphor for washing away sin. Making filthy clothes pure again was supposed to represent making filthy souls pure again. The physical labour of cleaning was meant to parallel the spiritual labour of reformation. One historian who studied Victorian reform schools wrote that the symbolism of laundry work was taken very seriously. The daily performance of washing was supposed to teach girls about cleanliness, purity, the transformation from dirty to clean. It was meant to be a lesson inscribed on their bodies through repetitive labour. But here is what that scholarship sometimes misses. It just hurt. It was exhausting. And for girls who are already malnourished, already traumatised, already stressed by the constant surveillance and discipline, adding hours of hard manual labour every day was not reformative. It was punishing. There are records of girls whose hands became so damaged from the laundry work that they could barely hold a pen to write during the morning lessons. There are accounts of girls fainting from exhaustion in the laundry room, especially in summer when the heat from the fires and the steam from the water made the workspace nearly unbearable. And the thing is, this was not unique to Red Lodge. This was standard across girls' reformatories and industrial schools throughout England. While boys learned trades that might lift them slightly above the lowest rungs of society, girls were being trained for domestic servitude. They were being prepared to go into service in wealthy households, where they would clean and wash and cook and serve for minimal wages, always under someone else's control. Rima Pinter wrote that her goal was to prepare girls for the natural restraints of the home, but what she meant was preparing them to accept the restraints of other people's homes, to be servants, to be useful to the middle and upper classes that employed domestic staff. And there was a whole economic system behind this that we will explore more deeply later. But for now, just understand that the girls at Red Lodge were not just being reformed, they were being processed, transformed from one kind of working class existence into another, slightly more acceptable kind. From girls who stole bread to survive into women who would scrub other people's floors to survive. After the afternoon work came a brief period of recreation, though this too was highly structured. The girls might be allowed to walk in the small garden behind Red Lodge, but always supervised, always in groups, never alone. They might play some simple games, though nothing too rowdy or undignified. Mostly recreation meant quiet activities that reinforced femininity. Sewing, knitting, perhaps singing hymns. Fun was not really the point of recreation. The point was teaching the girls to use their rare free time in appropriate restrained feminine ways. Then came supper. More simple food, bread, soup, maybe some vegetables, occasionally a bit of meat but not often. Again eaten in silence, again monitored for infractions. After supper, more religious instruction, evening prayers, more hymns, more lectures about sin and virtue, and the importance of gratitude for being rescued from your terrible former life. And then, finally, bed. Back to those dormitories with the rows of narrow beds, no privacy, always observed. Lights out at a prescribed time, usually around 8 or 9 in the evening. No talking after lights out, no getting up unless absolutely necessary. Sleep under surveillance. This was every day, Monday through Saturday. Sunday was slightly different. More church services, more prayer, less work, but still utterly structured, still controlled from morning to night. Now, Mary Carpenter had implemented something she called a marks system to manage behaviour. This was supposed to be enlightened, progressive. Instead of just punishing girls for bad behaviour, you would also reward them for good behaviour. Positive reinforcement alongside negative consequences. Here is how it worked. Girls could earn marks for things like obedience, cleanliness, good work, attendance at prayers, proper comportment. They could lose marks for infractions, talking during meals, poorly made beds, slow work, defiance, any number of things. If you accumulated enough marks, you might earn small privileges, maybe a piece of fruit, maybe an extra portion at supper, maybe the chance to have one of those baby rabbits we mentioned earlier, if you somehow had money to buy one. If you lost too many marks, you faced punishments that escalated from minor deprivations to serious consequences. On paper, this sounds reasonable, right? A system of incentives that teaches cause and effect, rewards and consequences. But in practice, the mark system became another tool of control. because the staff decided what earned marks and what lost them. The standards were subjective. A girl who spoke up to defend herself might be marked down for defiance. A girl who cried from homesickness might be marked down for weakness. A girl who showed too much spirit or intelligence or personality might find herself losing marks for behaviours that were not technically against the rules, but just made staff uncomfortable. And here is something I find fascinating and sad. There are records of girls becoming obsessed with the mark system, keeping meticulous mental tallies, doing everything possible to earn marks and avoid losing them. Because in an environment where you have almost no control over your own life, those marks represented the only thing you could influence through your choices. Some girls internalized the system completely, became model residents, did everything they were told, suppressed every natural impulse toward rebellion or independence, or even just normal childhood exuberance. And these girls were held up as success stories. Look how reformed she is. Look how obedient. Look how well she has learned her place. But other girls could not or would not play the game. They talked back, they fought, they refused to work or did their work poorly on purpose. They broke rules deliberately, almost daring the staff to punish them. And for these girls, the mark system meant a spiral of increasing punishments, increasing isolation, increasing desperation. Judy Carpenter wrote in her journals about girls she called incorrigible, impossible to correct, resistant to reform, and you can hear her frustration in those entries. She had this beautiful theory about love transforming wayward children, but when confronted with actual traumatized, angry, grieving children who would not transform on her timeline, she did not question her methods. She questioned the girls. She would write things like, "This girl seems determined to resist all efforts at improvement." Not, "This child is clearly suffering and needs different support." Not, "Perhaps my approach is not working for her particular needs," but rather, "She is determined to resist." As if an 11-year-old locked in an institution against her will, separated from everything familiar, forced to labour for hours every day, should just happily accept her transformation into someone else's idea of a proper woman. The daily routine at Red Lodge was designed to break girls down and rebuild them. Break down their independence, their street smarts, their survival instincts, their personalities, and rebuild them as servants, as domestic labourers, as women who knew their place and accepted it without question. And for some girls this worked, in the sense that they learned to comply. But compliance is not the same as reform. Obedience is not the same as transformation. And the psychological cost of this daily grinding routine, the constant surveillance, the lack of privacy, the endless labour, the suppression of self, that cost was never really calculated or acknowledged. What we're going to explore next is what happened when girls could not or would not comply. What happened when the daily routine was not enough to break them? What happened when love as a ruling sentiment gave way to something much darker? Because Red Lodge had those cells in the basement for a reason, and they got used more often than Mary Carpenter probably wanted to admit. There is a moment that appears in Mary Carpenter's journals from July of 1859 that I cannot stop thinking about. She is writing about a punishment she has just administered to a girl whose name is recorded only as E.M. The girl had been, in Mary's words, violent and refractory. We do not know what E.M. actually did. Maybe she fought with another girl. Maybe she talked back to a staff member. Maybe she just cried too loudly or refused to work or committed some minor infraction that, on a different day, might have been overlooked. But on this day, Mary Carpenter decided that E.M. needed to be taught a lesson. So E.M. was taken down to the basement of Red Lodge, down the narrow stone stairs that still exist today, and locked in one of the cells. Mary writes in her journal that the girl was left there for 8 hours. 8 hours, alone, in the dark, in a stone room barely large enough to stand in. And when EM was finally released, Mary notes that the girl was much subdued and showed proper contrition. Proper contrition. As if the goal of punishment was not to teach or guide or even protect, but to break a child's spirit until she showed the proper emotional response to her captors. This is the part of the reformatory school story that makes everything we have talked about so far feel even more disturbing, because we can maybe understand, even if we do not agree with the daily routines, the hard labour, the limited education. We can see how Victorian society convinced itself that these things were necessary, even beneficial. But the punishments, the deliberate infliction of suffering on children in the name of love and reform, that is harder to rationalise even by Victorian standards. Let me describe what those cells were actually like, because I think it is important to really understand this. The basement of Red Lodge is not some modern, well-lit storage area. It is the original basement from when the building was constructed in 1568. Stone walls, stone floors, damp even in summer, cold, so cold in winter. The doors were heavy wood fitted with locks that could only be opened from the outside. When you visit Red Lodge today as a museum, you can go down into that basement. The cells are still there. They have been preserved as part of the building's history. And even now, with electric lights and tourists wandering through, there is something oppressive about those spaces. They are small, confining. You can feel the weight of the building above you. Now imagine being a child locked in one of those rooms in total darkness. Because they did not leave candles or lamps with the girls, that would be a fire hazard. And also the darkness was part of the punishment. Imagine the sounds, the old building settling, rats scurrying in the walls, water dripping somewhere. Imagine the smell, damp stone, mould, your own fear. Imagine not knowing how long you would be left there. An hour? A day? Longer? Mary Carpenter's journals reveal that cells were used regularly, especially in the early years of Red Lodge when she was still figuring out how to manage the girls. She writes about girls being locked up for violent outbursts, for refusing to work, for creating disturbances, for corrupting other girls with bad language. But here is what gets me. Mary Carpenter genuinely believed this was an act of love. She believed that isolating a child in the dark was a form of correction that would help them, that would save them from their own worst impulses. She wrote about discipline being necessary for moral development. She wrote about how children needed to learn that actions had consequences, and maybe that is true in some abstract sense, but there is a difference between natural consequences and deliberately traumatizing a child. There is a difference between teaching cause and effect and using isolation as a weapon to break a child's will. The thing is, corporal punishment was absolutely standard in Victorian institutions. In fact, Red Lodge was considered relatively mild compared to some reformatories. There were institutions where beating children was routine, where the birch rod, that is a bundle of thin branches bound together specifically for whipping, where the birch rod was used so frequently that the sound of it became part of the daily soundscape. Let me tell you about what happened at other reformatories, because it helps put Red Lodge in context. At Whitwick in Leicestershire, there was a reformatory run by monks that opened in 1856. It was supposed to house up to 250 Catholic boys and teach them agricultural work. But the staff could not control the boys. There were riots, multiple riots. The boys attacked staff members, and in 1878, 60 boys escaped after attacking the master in charge with knives they had stolen from the dining room. Knives. That is how desperate they were to get away. The institution was finally shut down in 1881 after its certification was withdrawn because the conditions had become so bad, the violence so endemic, that even Victorian authorities, who tolerated, decided it had to close. On the naval training ships, yes, there were floating reformatories on ships moored in rivers. Boys regularly mutinied. The Akbar on the Mersey, one of the training ships specifically for Catholic boys, had such frequent disturbances that staff basically lived in a state of constant tension, never sure when the next rebellion would explode. And the punishments at these institutions made Red Lodge look gentle by comparison. Boys and girls at various reformatories were subjected to what were called cold water punishments. Let me describe what this actually meant. If a child was deemed to be malingering, pretending to be sick to avoid work, or if they were considered particularly defiant, they would be taken outside, even in winter, and have buckets of cold water thrown over them. Not one bucket, not two. The publication John Bull reported in 1910 about one case where a boy had 52 buckets of cold water thrown over him in wintry weather. He nearly died. 52 buckets. Can you even imagine the hypothermia, the shock to the system, the absolute terror of knowing they were going to keep pouring water on you and there was nothing you could do to stop it? Birching was standard. This involved stripping a child partially or fully and beating them with those bundled branches across the back and buttocks until the skin broke and bled. Caning with heavy wooden canes that left bruises that lasted weeks. Deprivation of food. Being given nothing but bread and water for days at a time, which for children who are already undernourished was particularly cruel. Deprivation of clothing was also used. A child might be made to wear inadequate clothing in cold weather as punishment, or they might have their shoes taken away and be forced to work barefoot, even outdoors, even in winter. So yes, Red Lodge's punishment cells were terrible. But they existed within a system where corporal punishment of children was normalized, where Victorian society genuinely believed that physical suffering was good for the soul, where spare the rod and spoil the child was taken quite literally. Mary Carpenter actually wrote against excessive corporal punishment. She argued that it should be kept to a minimum, that it should be a last resort. She believed, and this was progressive for her time, that children responded better to kindness than to beating. But she also believed in those cells. She believed in isolation. She believed in what she called subduing resistant children. And there is this fascinating tension in her journals, where you can see her struggling with her own contradictions. She writes about how she wants to run Red Lodge based on love, on creating a family atmosphere. But then she writes about girls who make her so angry, so frustrated that she cannot see them as children who need help. She sees them as problems that need to be solved, threats that need to be neutralized. There is an entry from 1857 where she writes about a girl who kept running away. Every time staff turned their backs, this girl would try to escape. She was caught multiple times, brought back, punished, and then she would try again. Mary writes that she finally had to keep the girl in isolation for an extended period. Weeks, it sounds like, though she is not specific, until the girl accepted her situation. Accepted her situation, not understood, not agreed. Accepted, as in gave up, stopped fighting, surrendered, and Mary frames this as a victory. The girl has been successfully reformed. But reading it now, it sounds like they just broke her. They kept her in that basement cell until she did not have the strength or hope to keep trying to escape. Now, there is a whole scholarly debate about how to interpret what Victorian reformers called hysterical outbursts by girls. Mary Carpenter and other superintendents would write about girls having hysterics, screaming, crying uncontrollably, sometimes even having what sound like panic attacks or dissociative episodes. They interpreted these as signs of moral weakness, of feminine instability, of the girl's inherent unfitness that needed to be corrected. But modern historians and psychologists looking at these same descriptions say, This is trauma. This is what happens when you take already traumatized children and traumatize them further. The hysterical outbursts were not signs of moral failing. They were signs of psychological breaking points. Some girls apparently went into what the records call states of stupor, where they would just shut down, stop speaking, stop responding to anything. Victorian staff interpreted this as stubbornness or manipulation, but it sounds a lot like dissociation, like a mind protecting itself by just checking out when reality becomes unbearable. There is also evidence that some of these outbursts were not uncontrolled hysteria at all, but calculated resistance. Girls would scream and cry and create disturbances not because they had lost control, but because they knew it disrupted the institution's precious order. They knew it made staff uncomfortable. They knew it might get them some attention, even if that attention came in the form of punishment, because at least punishment meant someone was acknowledging their existence. One historian who has studied Red Lodge extensively, a woman named Emma Williams, who did a residency at the Red Lodge Museum in 2020, she uncovered journals and letters and accounts books from the archives and used them to imagine the lives of the girls. She calls them the wicked girls of Red Lodge, reclaiming that word wicked that Mary Carpenter used so freely. Williams writes about how she wanted to disrupt the Dickensian narrative we have about Victorian poor children. You know, the image of the innocent, grateful, sweet little waif who just needs rescuing. She wanted to recover the anger, the defiance, the sheer bloody-minded resistance of girls who refuse to be reformed on someone else's terms. And reading through the records, you can find evidence of that resistance everywhere if you know how to look for it. Girls who deliberately did their laundry work poorly, forcing staff to redo it. Girls who sang obscene songs they had learned on the streets, corrupting the other girls with knowledge of a world the reformers wanted to erase. Girls who fought each other, yes, but maybe sometimes those fights were about maintaining hierarchies and alliances that gave them some sense of control in a place designed to strip all control away. There is one incident from the records, and I love this, where a group of girls had been learning about longitude and latitude in their geography lessons. Basic navigation stuff. And during their supervised recreation time, they gathered around a map and used their new knowledge to find an island. Just an island on the map. And they started talking about it, imagining it, creating stories about escaping to this island where they would be free. The staff shut this down immediately, reported it as concerning behaviour, because heaven forbid these imprisoned children dare to imagine freedom. But the fact that they did it, the fact that even under constant surveillance they found ways to dream together, to create small pockets of resistance, that tells you something about the human spirit that no amount of punishment could break in some of these girls. Of course, other girls were broken. Let us not romanticize this. The system destroyed some children. There are records of girls who became completely compliant, who internalized every rule, who seemed to lose all personality and become exactly the docile servants Victorian society wanted them to be. And Mary Carpenter would hold these girls up as examples of successful reform. But at what cost? If you take a spirited, angry, defiant child and turn her into a passive, obedient servant with no will of her own, have you reformed her or just damaged her in a different way? There is also evidence of girls harming themselves. The records are oblique about this. Victorian reformers did not like to acknowledge that their methods might drive children to self-harm, but there are references to girls being found with self-inflicted wounds, to girls who refused to eat in ways that seemed intentional, to girls who engaged in what the records call destructive behaviours toward themselves. And the response was more punishment. Because in the Victorian mindset, even self-harm was a moral failing, a sign of defiance against God's will, something that needed to be disciplined out of the child. The punishment regime at Red Lodge created a culture of fear. Girls learned quickly which staff members were kind and which were harsh. They learned which infractions were more likely to be overlooked and which would definitely result in punishment. They learned how to appear compliant while harbouring secret resentments. They learned survival skills, but not the kind Mary Carpenter intended. And here is perhaps the saddest part. Some girls probably started to believe they deserved the punishment. When you are told from morning to night that you are wicked, that you are morally corrupt, that you need to be reformed, that everything bad that happens to you is because of your own failings, especially if you are a child, especially if you have no other frame of reference, you might start to internalize that message. You might start to believe that yes, you are bad, yes, you deserve to suffer, yes, this is all for your own good. The psychological damage of that internalization, we cannot even fully measure it because the girls themselves left so few records of their own experiences. We have Mary Carpenter's journals, we have staff reports, we have official inspection documents, but the girls' voices, their actual thoughts and feelings, those are mostly silent in the historical record, except in their resistance, except in the disturbances they created, except in the fact that they kept trying to escape even when they knew they would be caught and punished. Their resistance is their voice, speaking across more than a century and a half, saying, "We did not accept this. We fought back. You tried to break us and some of us refused to break. But what happened to the girls who did break? What happened to the girls who learned compliance so thoroughly that they could not imagine any other way to be? And what happened when these girls, broken or defiant, reformed or just trained to fake it, what happened when they finished their sentences and were released back into the world? That is what we need to talk about next. Because the question of whether reformatory schools actually worked, whether they actually helped these girls build better lives, that is where the rubber meets the road. That is where we find out if Mary Carpenter's vision of love-based reform was anything more than a beautiful theory covering brutal reality. Here is something that might surprise you. Mary Carpenter did not see all the girls who came to Red Lodge as equally salvageable. She had very specific ideas about which girls would be easier to reform and which would be more difficult. And those ideas were based not on the individual child's circumstances or personality, but on where that child came from. Geography, in Mary Carpenter's mind, determined morality. I want to read you something she wrote in her Red Lodge journal in July of 1859. She is making observations about the different types of girls coming to her reformatory from different parts of England and Wales. And her words reveal something that goes beyond individual prejudice. They show us how Victorian reformers mapped moral corruption onto regional and class identities in ways that are honestly shocking. Mary wrote, "I have noticed that the London girls exhibit deep wickedness. The Manchester girls are particularly daring and thoroughly acquainted with vice. The Welsh girls are low, coarse, vulgar, and profoundly ignorant. Deep wickedness, thoroughly acquainted with vice. Low, coarse, vulgar, and profoundly ignorant. These are not descriptions of individual children who have committed specific acts. These are blanket characterizations based solely on where the girls came from. A girl from London was automatically assumed to be deeply wicked. A girl from Manchester was presumed to know all about vice. A Welsh girl was dismissed as coarse and ignorant before she even opened her mouth. Think about what this meant in practice. When a new girl arrived at Red Lodge, before she had done anything, before staff had observed her behaviour or gotten to know her at all, judgments had already been made about her character based on her place of origin. The London girl walked in already labelled as wicked. The Welsh girl walked in already considered vulgar. And these labels shaped how they were treated, what was expected of them, how their actions were interpreted. If a London girl acted out, it confirmed her deep wickedness. If a Welsh girl struggled with lessons, it confirmed her profound ignorance. The prejudice became self-fulfilling. But where did these regional stereotypes come from? Why did Victorian reformers have such specific ideas about the moral character of different cities and regions? Part of it was urbanisation and industrialisation. London was the largest city in the world at that time, with over 2 million people by the mid-19th century. It was a place of extreme wealth and extreme poverty existing side by side. The slums of East London, places like Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, Shoreditch, these were considered dens of vice and crime by respectable society. The perception was that London's poorest children were exposed to criminal behaviour from birth, that they grew up in an environment so morally corrupt that wickedness was inevitable. Manchester was the heart of industrial England, the textile capital where factories dominated the landscape and working-class life was brutal. The perception of Manchester girls as daring and acquainted with vice probably came from the fact that young women in Manchester often worked in factories alongside men, which Victorian morality considered improper and likely to lead to sexual immorality. Working-class women in industrial cities had more independence and less supervision than middle-class girls, and Victorian reformers interpreted this independence as dangerous freedom that would obviously lead to vice. And Wales. The prejudice against Welsh girls was rooted in ethnic and cultural discrimination. Wales was considered backward by English standards, more rural, less developed, the people speaking a different language and maintaining different customs. When Mary Carpenter called Welsh girls low, coarse, vulgar and profoundly ignorant, she was not just judging individuals, she was expressing English cultural superiority over the Welsh people as a whole. But here is what really gets me. These girls had been convicted of basically the same kinds of crimes regardless of where they came from. Stealing food, stealing clothes, being homeless, being found in the wrong places. The regional variations Mary Carpenter observed were not in what the girls had done, but in how she interpreted their characters based on where they were from. This kind of geographic prejudice was not unique to Mary Carpenter. It was systemic across the reformatory school movement. If you look at inspection reports from different institutions, you find similar patterns. Girls and boys from major industrial cities were consistently described as more difficult, more corrupted, harder to reform than those from smaller towns or rural areas. And this affected funding and resources too. Some reformatory schools specifically advertised that they took children from particular regions. There were institutions that would only accept children from certain counties. There were schools that specialised in the criminal classes of London versus schools that focused on rural poor children. The assumption was that different origins required different approaches, but we need to talk about an even darker aspect of regional variation in the reformatory system: racial segregation. Victorian England was not as racially homogeneous as popular imagination sometimes suggests. There were black British people, there were immigrants from various parts of the British Empire, there were mixed-race children born in British ports with connections to the slave trade and merchant shipping. These children existed. They got arrested for the same poverty crimes as white children, and they were systematically excluded from most reformatory and industrial schools. The records are quite clear about this. Black children were traditionally kept out of reformatory institutions unless separate facilities were created exclusively for them. In the United States, where the reformatory movement spread from Britain, this segregation was even more explicit. There was an institution in Philadelphia called the Colored House of Refuge that was created specifically because black youth were not allowed in the regular reformatories. And here is the really insidious part. When separate institutions for black children did exist, they did not offer the same types of education and training that white institutions provided. White girls learned domestic service, yes, but at least there was the pretense that they were being trained for respectable positions in middle-class households. Black girls in segregated institutions were trained for what the records explicitly call gendered menial labour, the lowest, hardest, worst paid work available. The same pattern held for boys. White boys in reformatories learned carpentry, tailoring, shoemaking, skilled trades that could lead to journeyman positions and some measure of economic security. Black boys in segregated institutions, they were trained for agricultural labour or the most basic manual work, jobs with no path to advancement, no possibility of moving up in social class. So the reformatory system, which claimed to be about saving children and giving them opportunities, actually reinforced and institutionalized racial hierarchies. It took existing social inequalities and codified them, trained children from different backgrounds for different destinies, and presented this as natural, as appropriate, as serving the proper order of society. Back to Red Lodge, though we have no evidence that Red Lodge admitted black girls, the records suggest it was an all-white institution, which itself tells us something about who Mary Carpenter considered worthy of reform. But there were other forms of segregation that shaped the reformatory system in England. Religion was huge. Victorian England was deeply divided along religious lines, with tensions between Anglicans, various Protestant denominations, and Catholics. And reformatory schools reflected these divisions. There were Anglican reformatories, Methodist reformatories, Catholic reformatories, Quaker reformatories. Each denomination ran institutions based on their particular theological views and moral frameworks. Catholic reformatories were specifically for Catholic children, and in a country where anti-Catholic prejudice was strong, these institutions faced particular scrutiny. Remember the Akbar naval training ship we mentioned earlier that was specifically for Catholic boys, moored on the Mersey? There was another Catholic ship called the Clarence. The fact that Catholic children needed separate institutions tells you something about how divided Victorian society was. And Catholic reformatories often had a harder time getting funding and support compared to Protestant institutions. Inspectors sometimes wrote more critical reports about Catholic schools, not necessarily because conditions were worse, but because Protestant inspectors brought their own prejudices to their assessments. Mary Carpenter herself was Unitarian, which was a liberal Protestant denomination that faced its own discrimination from mainstream Anglicans. Unitarians did not believe in the Trinity, which traditional Christians considered heretical. So even Mary, with all her privilege and education and social connections, existed in a religious minority that was viewed with suspicion by the established church. But at Red Lodge, Mary imposed a very strict evangelical Protestant framework on the girls regardless of what religious background they came from. Morning prayers, evening prayers, Bible study, hymns, all from a Protestant perspective. If a Catholic girl ended up at Red Lodge, she would be subjected to Protestant religious instruction whether she wanted it or not. The goal was not just to reform behaviour but to reshape spiritual beliefs. There is also evidence of class-based variation within the reformatory system that goes beyond just rich versus poor. Victorian society had incredibly fine-grained class distinctions. You were not just working class or middle class, you were upper working class, lower working class, respectable working class, rough working class, skilled labourer, unskilled labourer, and on and on. And reformatory schools made distinctions based on these gradations. Some industrial schools, remember, industrial schools were technically for children who needed protection rather than children convicted of crimes. Some industrial schools specifically catered to what they called the deserving poor. These were children of working-class families who were poor but respectable. Maybe the father had died and the mother could not support the children alone. Maybe there was illness or temporary unemployment. But the family had a reputation for decency, for trying, for maintaining respectability despite hardship. These children were seen as different from the children of what Victorians called the dangerous classes, families that were considered irredeemably criminal, that lived in the worst slums, that were associated with prostitution and theft and alcoholism. And the institutions for deserving poor children offered better conditions, more opportunities, less harsh discipline than institutions for children from dangerous classes. Mary Carpenter herself used this language. The title of her influential book was Reformatory Schools for the Children of the Perishing and Dangerous Classes. Perishing and dangerous. Even in her most compassionate moments, she saw poor children through this dual lens. They were either victims who deserved rescue or threats who needed containment. And often the same child could be both in her mind, perishing because of their circumstances, dangerous because of what those circumstances had made them. Regional prejudices also affected post-release planning. When girls finished their sentences at reformatories, staff were supposed to help place them in employment. But the placements offered to girls from different regions reflected the same prejudices we have been talking about. A girl from a small town or rural area might be placed with a relatively respectable middle-class family as a house servant, with hopes that she could work her way into a stable position. But a London girl? She was more likely to be placed in the roughest, lowest-paid domestic positions, cleaning in boarding houses or working in commercial laundries, because the assumption was that she could not be trusted in a respectable home. Her wickedness, her London origins, marked her as suitable only for the hardest, worst work, and this became another self-fulfilling prophecy. If you place a girl in terrible conditions with terrible pay and no support, she is much more likely to fail, to end up back on the streets, to validate the initial prejudice that she was irredeemably wicked. Whereas if you actually invest in a girl's placement, give her decent working conditions and some support system, she has a much better chance of succeeding. But Victorian reformers did not see it that way. They saw their prejudices confirmed by outcomes that their prejudices had created. There is a case in the records, and I find this particularly heartbreaking, of a girl we will call J.T. from Liverpool, who finished her sentence at an industrial school in the 1870s. She was 14, had been well behaved during her time in the institution, had learned all the required domestic skills. Staff wrote in her file that she showed promise and could potentially do well in a good placement. But when it came time to find her a position, they placed her in a lodging house in one of the roughest parts of Liverpool, working for an employer known to be difficult. Why? The notes suggest it was because she was from Liverpool originally, and reformatory staff assumed she would be more comfortable returning to her own kind, rather than placing her in a middle-class household where her rough origins would be obvious. Within 6 months, JT was back on the streets. The lodging house work was brutal, the employer was abusive, she ran away, and she ended up arrested again for theft. The system marked her down as a failure, another girl who could not be saved from her own moral weakness. But was it her moral weakness, or was it the system that set her up to fail based on assumptions about Liverpool girls? This is the insidious thing about prejudice in institutional systems. It does not just affect how people are treated in the moment, it shapes their entire futures. It determines what opportunities they receive, what support they get, what people expect from them, and then, when those limited opportunities lead to failure, the prejudice is retroactively justified. See, we were right about those London girls all along. We were right about those Welsh girls. They really are what we said they were, except they never had a fair chance to be anything else. The regional and ethnic hierarchies in the Victorian reformatory system reveal something important about the entire project of reform. It was never just about helping individual children. It was about maintaining social order, about keeping different groups in their proper places, about reproducing the class and ethnic and regional hierarchies that Victorian society was built on. Mary Carpenter could write beautiful things about love and family and giving children second chances, but she could also write casually about London wickedness and Welsh coarseness. could participate in a system that excluded black children entirely, could accept as natural that girls from different places deserve different futures. And this tension between the rhetoric of salvation and the reality of social control, between the language of love and the practice of discrimination, this is at the heart of what reformatory schools actually were. Coming up, we need to talk about the aspect of reformatory life that Victorian society was most uncomfortable acknowledging, but most obsessed with controlling: sexuality. Because if you think the regional prejudices were bad, wait until you hear how reformatory schools approach the question of girls' sexual behaviour and what that reveals about Victorian anxieties around female bodies and desire. The next part of our story gets into some dark territory around sexual control and moral panic, but it is essential to understanding the full picture of what these institutions were really about. If you really want to understand what Victorian reformatory schools were about, what they were really truly about, you need to understand this. They were not primarily concerned with theft or violence or even poverty. Those were just the visible symptoms. What Victorian reformers were actually terrified of, what kept them awake at night, what drove the entire system of locking up poor girls, was sex. Female sexuality. The possibility that working-class girls might have sexual knowledge, sexual experience, or worst of all, sexual agency. That was the real moral corruption they were trying to stamp out. Let me tell you about what happened in British cities in the 1860s that triggered a full-blown national panic about sexuality and led directly to some of the most invasive, degrading legislation ever passed in Victorian England. It all started with the military. British soldiers and sailors stationed in port cities were contracting venereal diseases at alarming rates. Syphilis and gonorrhea were spreading through military ranks, affecting combat readiness, costing the government money. And Victorian authorities looked at this problem and decided the solution was not to address male sexual behaviour or provide medical treatment or educate soldiers. No, the solution was to control women's bodies. In 1864, Parliament passed the first of what would become known as the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws, and I need you to really hear this, these laws allowed police in certain designated towns to arrest any woman they suspected of being a prostitute. Any woman, based on nothing but suspicion. Maybe she was out alone at night. Maybe she was dressed in a way that seemed too provocative. Maybe she was just in the wrong neighbourhood, or looked too working class to be respectable. Once arrested, the woman was forced to undergo a medical examination. And when I say medical examination, I mean an invasive, humiliating internal examination of her genitals, performed by male doctors without her consent to determine if she had venereal disease. If she was found to be infected, she could be locked up in what they called a lock hospital until she was declared cured. This could take weeks, months, and during that time she had no income, no way to support herself or her family, no legal recourse. The examination itself was a form of sexual violence, having your body forcibly penetrated by strangers as punishment for suspected sexual activity. And here is the absolutely insane part. The male customers, the soldiers and sailors who were spreading disease just as much as the prostitutes, faced no examination, no arrest, no consequences whatsoever. Zero. The entire burden of controlling venereal disease was placed on women's bodies. Can you imagine? A soldier could visit prostitutes every night, contract syphilis, spread it to multiple women, and face nothing. But a woman suspected of prostitution, even if she was not actually selling sex, even if she was just a woman in a public space at the wrong time, she could be grabbed off the street and violated in the name of public health. Between 1864 and 1869, two more Contagious Diseases Acts were passed, expanding the powers of police and the number of towns where the acts applied. By 1869, any woman in certain districts could be subject to forced examination if any police officer decided she looked like a prostitute. Now a group of women rose up to fight this. The Ladies' National Association, led by a remarkable woman named Josephine Butler, launched a massive campaign for repeal. Josephine Butler argued, and this was radical for the time, that these acts represented a sexual double standard that punished women for behaviour that men engaged in freely. She pointed out that it was always men who controlled the system, men who purchased sex, men who policed women, men who examined women, men who imprisoned women. Her campaign was controversial. Respectable Victorian women were not supposed to talk about prostitution or sex or venereal disease at all. It was considered inappropriate, unladylike, dangerous to women's delicate sensibilities. But Josephine Butler said, "No, we have to talk about this, because what is happening to these women is wrong." It took until 1886 before the Contagious Diseases Acts were finally repealed. 22 years of women being subjected to this legalized sexual violence. So why am I telling you about the Contagious Diseases Acts in a story about reformatory schools? Because the same obsession with controlling female sexuality that drove those acts also drove the reformatory school system. The belief that women's bodies, especially working-class women's bodies, needed to be monitored, controlled and disciplined was absolutely central to Victorian reform ideology. When reformatory schools assessed girls, they were not just looking at what crime the girl had committed. They were trying to determine if she was sexually pure or sexually corrupted. And this determination shaped everything about how she was treated. There were girls sent to reformatory schools not because they had stolen anything or hurt anyone, but simply because they'd been exposed to moral danger, which was code for sexual danger. Maybe she lived in a house where prostitution occurred. Maybe she had been seen talking to men. Maybe someone suspected she was not a virgin. That was enough. Let me tell you about a real case from the 1860s. There was a girl, 15 years old, we will call her MH, who was committed to a reformatory school in Yorkshire. Her crime? She was found living in lodgings that authorities described as frequented by persons of immoral character. Not prostitutes, just persons of immoral character, which could mean almost anything Victorian moralists disapproved of. There is no evidence that MH herself engaged in any sexual activity. No evidence she stole anything. No evidence of violence. But the mere fact that she was in proximity to immorality was considered dangerous enough that she needed 5 years of reformatory school to save her from potential moral corruption. 5 years of her adolescence, from 15 to 20, locked up because of where she was living. Or consider the case of teenage girls who actually were prostitutes. And yes, child prostitution was rampant in Victorian cities. Girls as young as 12 or 13 selling sex because they had no other way to survive. Victorian society created the economic conditions that made child prostitution inevitable. Poverty, lack of employment opportunities for women, the starvation wages paid for legitimate work, and then punished the girls for responding to those conditions. When a teenage prostitute ended up in a reformatory school, the entire focus was on restoring her purity, as if sexual experience was a stain that could be washed away through enough prayer and hard labour. There was no acknowledgement that she might have been coerced or trafficked or desperate. There was no trauma counselling, no attempt to address what had happened to her. Just judgment and attempts to make her forget, to remake her into a virgin in spirit if not in body. The obsession with virginity and purity shaped every aspect of reformatory life. Remember how we talked about the sleeping arrangements, with beds in rows so girls could be constantly observed? That was explicitly to prevent what Victorians called self-abuse, masturbation. Victorian medical theory held that masturbation caused insanity, physical weakness, moral degeneracy. For girls, it was considered especially dangerous because it indicated sexual desire, which respectable women were not supposed to have. So the dormitories were designed for surveillance. Staff walked through at night with lanterns, checking to make sure girls were sleeping with their hands visible above the blankets. Any girl caught touching herself faced severe punishment, potentially isolation in those basement cells, definitely loss of privileges, and intense shaming. One Victorian doctor, a man named J.H. Kellogg, yes, the same Kellogg who invented cornflakes, he actually recommended applying pure carbolic acid to girls' clitorises as a way to prevent masturbation. Carbolic acid, a caustic chemical that burns tissue. This was considered acceptable medical treatment for the problem of female sexual feeling. Now, there is no evidence that Red Lodge or most reformatories went that far, but the mindset was there. The belief that female sexuality was dangerous, abnormal, something that needed to be controlled and ideally eliminated. The religious instruction at reformatory schools reinforced this constantly. Bible verses about purity, about sexual sin, about the dangers of the flesh. Sermons warning that sexual thoughts would lead to damnation. Hymns about remaining spotless and clean for God. The message drummed into these girls day after day was that their bodies were inherently shameful, that any sexual feeling was evil, that purity was their only value. And for girls who had been sexually abused, and many of them had been, because sexual abuse of poor children was common and rarely prosecuted, this message was devastating. Instead of support and understanding, they got shame. Instead of being told that what happened to them was not their fault, they were treated as if they were contaminated, ruined. There is a whole body of Victorian literature about what they called fallen women trying to redeem themselves. Stories where prostitutes or sexually active women seek salvation through religion and self-sacrifice. Many of these stories end with the woman dying, often of illness, sometimes by suicide, because apparently death was preferable to living as a non-virgin. This narrative showed up in how reformatory schools talked about their work. They were rescuing girls from lives of vice. They were saving them from moral ruin. The language of salvation was everywhere, but what it actually meant was controlling sexuality. Organisations dedicated to reforming prostitutes sprang up across England. Charles Dickens, as we mentioned earlier, worked with Angela Burdett Coutts to set up Magdalene houses, named after Mary Magdalene, the biblical prostitute, where fallen women could be rehabilitated. The plan was often to train them in domestic service and then ship them to Australia or other colonies, as if physical distance from England would somehow erase their sexual past. Think about that for a second. The solution to women having sexual experience was to exile them to the other side of the world. That is how deeply Victorian society wanted to remove any reminder of female sexuality from respectable view. And it was not just prostitutes who faced this treatment. Any woman who had a child out of wedlock, any woman suspected of sexual activity outside marriage, could find herself in a Magdalene house or a reformatory, or some other institution designed to correct her moral failings. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 raised the age of sexual consent to 16, which sounds progressive, right? Protecting children from sexual exploitation. Except the Act also gave police broad powers to raid brothels and arrest anyone associated with prostitution, which often meant arresting the women and girls while the male customers walked away. The Act was passed partly due to a scandal involving child prostitution. An investigative journalist named W.T. Stead had published a series of articles called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, exposing how young girls were being purchased and sold for sex. To prove his point, Stead actually purchased a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong from her mother for £5, then immediately took her to safety to demonstrate how easy it was to buy a child. The scandal caused massive outrage. Parliament rushed to pass the Criminal Law Amendment Act, but here is the twist. W.T. Stead was arrested and imprisoned for his role in purchasing the girl, even though he did it to expose the practice, and while the act did make it illegal to procure girls under 16 for prostitution, it did not address the economic desperation that pushed families to sell their daughters. It did not create support systems for girls who'd been trafficked. It just gave authorities more power to arrest people, mostly women. Josephine Butler's Ladies' National Association was also part of a broader social purity movement that gained strength in the 1880s and 1890s. This movement had some genuinely progressive goals: ending child prostitution, improving age of consent laws, fighting human trafficking. But it also promoted sexual abstinence, condemned any sex outside of marriage, and wanted to impose strict moral codes on everyone's behaviour. And here is where it gets complicated, because some of the women leading the social purity movement genuinely wanted to protect other women. They saw the sexual double standard and wanted to end it. But their solution was not to give women more sexual freedom, it was to impose the same restrictions on men that society already imposed on women. Make everyone equally repressed rather than making everyone equally free. This tension played out in reformatory schools all the time. On one hand, reformers like Mary Carpenter genuinely cared about girls and wanted to save them from sexual exploitation. On the other hand, their method of saving involved controlling and shaming and stripping away any sense of bodily autonomy. There is a case I came across in the research that really illustrates this contradiction. A 16-year-old girl, we will call her SW, had been raped by her employer when she was working as a domestic servant. She became pregnant. When the pregnancy was discovered, she was fired. The employer faced no consequences, but SW was arrested for having an illegitimate child and sent to an industrial school where she gave birth, and then had the baby taken away from her. She was the victim of a crime. But Victorian society treated her as the criminal. At the industrial school, staff focused on reforming her moral character, as if she had done something wrong by being raped and becoming pregnant. The daily lessons and prayers all emphasized the same theme. She needed to be more virtuous, more pure, more careful about her behavior around men, as if any of what happened was her fault. And this was not unusual. It was standard. Girls who were victims of sexual violence were treated as if they had invited it, as if they bore responsibility for men's actions, as if their mere existence as female was a temptation that men could not resist. The whole Victorian ideology around female sexuality was built on this bizarre contradiction. Women were supposed to be naturally pure and free of sexual desire, but they were also dangerous temptresses who led men astray. Women were morally superior to men, but they also needed constant male supervision and control. Women were victims who needed protection, but also threats who needed containment. And reformatory schools for girls were where all these contradictions got enacted on children's bodies. You're pure and must stay that way, but you're also already corrupted just by being poor and exposed to vice. You're a victim who needs saving, but you're also probably lying about being innocent. You deserve compassion, but you also deserve punishment. Love and violence all mixed together. What comes next is perhaps the most cynical aspect of the reformatory system, the economics. Because while all this rhetoric about purity and salvation was happening, reformatory schools were also operating as businesses that profited from girls' labour. The idealism and the exploitation were not separate, they were intertwined. An understanding that relationship helps explain why the system persisted for so long despite causing so much harm. Let us follow the money and see where it leads. Money. Let us talk about money. Because for all the beautiful rhetoric about saving souls and reforming characters, reformatory schools had to fund themselves somehow. And the way they did it reveals something uncomfortable about the entire system. These institutions were not just about rehabilitation. They were businesses that ran on the unpaid labour of children. Here is how it worked. Reformatory and industrial schools received some government funding. The Reformatory Schools Act of 1854 and the Industrial Schools Act of 1857 provided for partial treasury support. But that government money was never enough to cover operating costs. The institutions needed additional income to pay staff, maintain buildings, buy food and supplies. So where did that income come from? From the girls themselves, from their work. Remember those hours of laundry we talked about? The 4, 5, 6 hours every afternoon that girls at Red Lodge spent washing clothes until their hands were raw? That laundry was not just symbolic cleansing. It was a revenue stream. Neighbouring families and local institutions paid Red Lodge for laundry services. Real money. Money that went into the school's accounts and helped keep the institution running. The girls did not see any of that money. They were not paid wages. They were told they were being trained in valuable domestic skills, but the reality was that they were providing free labour that generated profit for the institution. And Red Lodge was not unique in this. It was standard practice across the reformatory system. Girls' labour was monetised under the guise of vocational training. Let me give you some numbers, because numbers make this concrete. In 1875, there were 54 certified reformatory schools and 82 industrial schools operating in England and Wales. That is 136 institutions housing thousands of children whose labour contributed to the institution's financial sustainability. By 1885, those numbers had grown. 61 reformatories, 136 industrial schools, 9 truant schools and 13-day industrial schools. We are talking about hundreds of institutions across the country, all following similar models where children's work offset operational costs. Some historians who have studied the economics of these institutions estimate that child labour could reduce operating costs by 20 to 30%. Think about that. Nearly a third of the cost of running these places was covered by unpaid child labour dressed up as education. Now, Victorian reformers would have bristled at calling this exploitation. They would say, "We are teaching these children valuable skills that will help them earn a living after they leave. The work is part of their training." And yes, technically the girls were learning domestic service skills. But let us be honest about what domestic service meant in Victorian England. Domestic service was the largest employer of working-class women in the 19th century. Millions of women worked as maids, cooks, laundresses and housekeepers in middle-class and upper-class homes. The work was hard, the hours were long, often 80 hours a week or more. The pay was terrible, and you lived in your employer's house under their constant supervision with almost no personal freedom. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it is basically the same conditions as the reformatory, just in a different building with a slightly better food. So when reformatory schools said they were training girls for domestic service, what they really meant was, "We are training you to accept a lifetime of hard labour for minimal compensation in service to people wealthier than you. We are teaching you to be useful to the middle and upper classes. We are preparing you to know your place and stay in it." And the girls understood this, even if they could not articulate it in those terms. They understood that all the scrubbing and washing and sewing was not really about becoming better people. It was about becoming better servants. But let us dig deeper into the economics, because there are some fascinating details in the historical records about how reformatories actually managed their money. Parents of girls in reformatory schools were required to contribute to the costs if they could afford it. The law specified that parents could be ordered to pay up to 5 shillings per week, payable quarterly in advance. 5 shillings was not nothing. For many working-class families, that represented a significant portion of their weekly income. So imagine your daughter steals some bread because she is hungry. She gets sentenced to a reformatory school. And now you, the parent who could not afford to feed her properly in the first place, are ordered to pay 5 shillings a week to the institution that has taken her away. The poverty that led to the crime is now being compounded by a financial penalty. And if you could not pay, well, that was noted in the records as evidence of parental failure. Further justification for keeping the child in the institution where she would supposedly be better off than with her inadequate family. But here is where it gets interesting. Not all reformatories charged the same fees or provided the same services. Some institutions catered to what they called voluntary cases. These were not children convicted by courts, but children whose parents voluntarily placed them in industrial schools because they could not care for them. And for voluntary placements, families had to pay higher fees. This created a 2-tier system within the reformatory network. Wealthier working-class families who could afford to pay could place their children in slightly better institutions with better conditions, better food, more education. Poorer families whose children were convicted of crimes and could not pay fees ended up in harsher institutions where the focus was purely on discipline and labour. So even within a system supposedly designed to help poor children, economic class determined the quality of care. The poorest children faced the worst conditions, while children from families with slightly more resources had better experiences. Poverty begat harsher punishment, which is exactly the opposite of what a compassionate reform system should do. Now, some reformatory schools were more economically successful than others, and understanding why tells us a lot about Victorian priorities. The cottage plan institutions like Bedford Hills in the United States, this model was also adopted in some British institutions. These were considered progressive and enlightened. Instead of housing dozens of girls in dormitories, the cottage plan divided children into small groups living in separate cottage-style buildings, each with maybe 25 to 30 girls. Each cottage had single rooms that girls could decorate, a kitchen, even flower gardens. This sounds lovely, right? Much more like a home than an institution, and it was presented as being about the girls' well-being, about creating a family atmosphere. But here is the thing, the cottage plan was expensive. It required more buildings, more staff, more resources. Only institutions that could secure significant funding, usually from wealthy philanthropists or through successful labour programs, could afford this model. So the most humane conditions were available only to institutions that had the best financial backing, which often meant institutions serving slightly less poor children, or institutions that had successfully monetised their inmates' labour. Red Lodge never adopted the cottage plan. Mary Carpenter did try to create a family atmosphere, but she was working within the constraints of a single repurposed mansion with limited funds. She could not afford to house girls in separate cottages with private rooms and flower gardens. So Red Lodge remained more institutionalized, more obviously a place of confinement rather than a home. And this brings us to something really important. The labour economy of reformatory schools was gendered in very specific ways. Boys in reformatory schools learned trades: carpentry, shoemaking, tailoring, metalwork, agricultural skills. These were marketable skills that could lead to paid employment, possibly even apprenticeships that might eventually lead to journeyman wages and some economic independence. Yes, boys also worked while in reformatories, and yes, their labour also contributed to the institution's income. But the nature of the work was different. Boys were learning skills that had value in the broader economy. Girls were learning to clean and wash and sew, skills that had value only in the context of serving others. And this difference persisted after release. When boys left reformatory schools, placement officers tried to find them positions with tradesmen or farmers where they could continue developing their skills. When girls left, they were placed in domestic service positions where their future prospects were severely limited. There is a legal case that illustrates this perfectly. In 1908, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in Muller v. Oregon that it was constitutional to limit women's working hours because women needed special protection due to their roles as mothers. The ruling said that women's labour should be limited to types of work that would not interfere with their maternal duties. Now this was framed as progressive, protecting women from exploitation. But the effect was to legally restrict what kinds of work women could do. And well into the 1920s, labour in women's prisons and reformatories was limited to sewing, cleaning and other domestic chores. Not because these were the only skills women could learn, but because these were the only skills society wanted women to have. So the labour economy of reformatory schools was not just about funding the institutions, it was about reproducing social hierarchies, teaching working-class girls to accept low-paid domestic servitude, teaching them that their value lay in being useful to wealthier families, preparing them for lives of economic dependence and submission. Mary Carpenter wrote about how important it was to teach girls habits of industry, by which she meant getting them accustomed to working long hours without complaint. She believed this was a kindness source, preparing them for the realities of working-class life. But step back and look at what that actually means. Teaching children to accept exploitation as normal. There are account books from Red Lodge preserved in the Bristol archives, and if you dig through them, you can see the economic reality of running the institution. Income from laundry services, payments from parents, government grants, donations from wealthy supporters, and on the expense side, staff salaries, food costs, building, maintenance, supplies. The girls appear in these accounts only as expenses, the cost of feeding them, clothing them, housing them, but their labour appears as income. They were simultaneously costs to be minimised and assets to be utilised. And the more successful an institution was at extracting labour from the children, the more financially stable it became, which meant it could expand, take in more children, extract more labour. The system incentivised maximising work and minimising costs, which meant feeding girls as little as possible, providing the cheapest clothing and supplies, and working them as hard as they could be worked, without causing visible harm that inspectors might notice. Inspections were supposed to ensure institutions maintained adequate standards, but inspectors rarely spent enough time to understand the daily reality of children's lives. They looked at account books, checked that minimum food rations were being provided, verified that education was happening for the required hours. But they did not spend weeks living in the institution, observing how exhausted the girls were, listening to their complaints, investigating whether the training was genuinely beneficial or just exploitation. And even when inspectors did notice problems, their reports had to be severe before institutions lost their certifications. Remember Whitwick, the reformatory we mentioned earlier, where 60 boys escaped with knives? That place operated for 25 years before it was finally shut down. 25 years of riots and violence and clearly inadequate conditions before authorities said, okay, this one has to close. The economic model was too entrenched. Too many institutions depended on it. Too many people's salaries and reputations were invested in maintaining the system. And most importantly, too many people genuinely believed that working-class children needed to learn their place through hard labour. There is a phrase that appears over and over in Victorian reform literature, the dignity of work. Reformers talked constantly about teaching children the dignity of work, about how labour would elevate their moral character. And yes, work can be meaningful and valuable. But there is a difference between meaningful work that builds skills and contributes to personal growth, and exploitative labour that primarily benefits others while keeping workers in subordinate positions. The girls at Red Lodge were not experiencing the dignity of work. They were experiencing the indignity of unpaid labour performed under coercion for the benefit of an institution that claimed to be saving them. And yet, some of the girls did succeed. Some of them did leave reformatory schools and find stable employment and build decent lives within the constraints available to working-class women in Victorian England. Does that vindicate the system? Does the fact that some children survived and even thrived in some ways justify the exploitation they experienced? That is the question we need to explore next. Because measuring the success or failure of reformatory schools is complicated. Yes, many girls were exploited. Yes, the system was built on labour extraction and social control, but what actually happened to these girls after they left? Did they re-offend? Did they find work? Did they marry and have families? Did they remember the reformatory as salvation or as trauma? The answers are not as simple as you might think, and understanding those nuances is essential if we want to honestly assess what reformatory schools accomplished and what they cost. What I love most about digging through historical archives is finding the moments where people refuse to behave the way the powerful expect them to behave. And in the records of Victorian reformatory schools, if you know how to look, you can find resistance everywhere. Small acts of defiance, large-scale rebellions, girls who simply would not be reformed, no matter how hard the system tried to break them. These are the stories that often get buried in official histories, because institutions did not like to advertise their failures. But the resistance was real, it were constant, and it tells us something profound about human resilience. Let me start with a story that Emma Williams, the writer-in-residence at Red Lodge Museum, uncovered when she was researching the archives in 2020. She was going through Mary Carpenter's journals and came across an entry that made her stop and rethink everything she thought she knew about these poor rescued waifs. There was a girl, we will call her Hannah, though that might not have been her real name, who arrived at Red Lodge in 1856. She was 12 years old, convicted of stealing ribbons from a shop. Ribbons, probably worth a few pennies, and she was sentenced to 4 years. Mary Carpenter's initial notes describe Hannah as sullen and resistant, not crying, not grateful to be rescued, sullen, which already tells you something, right? This girl was not performing the role of pathetic victim that Victorian reformers wanted to see. Within the first week, Hannah was sent to the punishment cells for refusing to work. She spent 3 days in isolation. When she came out, Mary noted that she showed no contrition and maintained a defiant attitude. Over the next year, Hannah racked up more punishment than probably any other girl at Red Lodge during that period. She talked during meals, she did her laundry work deliberately poorly, forcing staff to redo it. She sang what Mary called coarse songs from the streets, teaching them to other girls. She fought with staff members when they tried to correct her. She attempted to escape at least 3 times that we know of from the records. And here is what Emma Williams points out. Hannah was not out of control, she was strategically resisting. Every action she took disrupted the institution's order in specific ways. Talking during silent meals broke the discipline system. Doing work poorly undermined the economic model that depended on quality labour. Teaching other girls street songs spread knowledge that reformers wanted to erase, creating solidarity among the inmates. Fighting with staff challenged their authority directly. Escape attempts, even when they failed, demonstrated that she had not accepted her imprisonment. Hannah was waging a deliberate campaign of resistance. The records show that after 18 months, Mary Carpenter was at her wits' end. She wrote to the magistrate who had sentenced Hannah, asking if there was any way to transfer her to a different institution or extend her sentence so she could be sent to an adult prison where they might be better equipped to handle such an incorrigible case. Incorrigible, that word again, unable to be corrected, impossible to reform. But what Mary Carpenter saw as moral failure we might see differently. What if Hannah was not morally corrupt? What if she was just a 12-year-old girl who understood that she had been imprisoned for stealing ribbons and decided that was bullshit, and she was not going to pretend otherwise? Hannah eventually aged out of the system and was released at 16. We do not know what happened to her after that, whether she survived, whether she thrived, whether she ever stole anything again. But for 4 years she refused to be broken, and that refusal is documented in the very records of the institution that tried to break her. Emma Williams titled her research project "The Wicked Girls of Red Lodge," reclaiming that word that Mary Carpenter used so freely. Because yes, these girls were wicked by Victorian standards. They did not behave properly, they did not show proper gratitude, they did not accept their place. And thank God for that, honestly. Thank God some of them fought back. But individual resistance was one thing. Collective rebellion was another level entirely, and it happened more often than you might think. Remember the Whitwick Reformatory that we mentioned? The agricultural colony run by monks that housed up to 250 Catholic boys? That place had multiple full-scale riots. Multiple. We're not talking about 1 or 2 boys acting out. We are talking about dozens of boys simultaneously deciding they had had enough. The final riot that led to the institution's closure happened in 1878. 60 boys, 60, escaped after attacking staff members with knives they had stolen from the dining room. Can you imagine the level of organisation that requires? The planning, the coordination, the absolute determination to get out no matter what the consequences. These were not spontaneous outbursts. These were calculated acts of rebellion by children who had been systematically abused and had collectively decided to fight back. The Akbar training ship on the Mersey had similar problems. Naval training ships were a special type of reformatory, old vessels moored in rivers or harbours, converted into floating institutions where boys learned seamanship and naval discipline. The Akbar was specifically for Catholic boys, and it was notorious for mutinies. There is something darkly poetic about boys imprisoned on a ship designed to teach them discipline through maritime training, and those same boys organising mutinies like actual sailors rebelling against cruel captains. The staff at Akbar lived in constant tension, never knowing when the next uprising would explode. And these were not isolated incidents. If you go through in certain reports and newspaper accounts from the Victorian era, you find story after story of children in reformatories rioting, escaping, attacking staff, burning down buildings. The system was much more unstable than official histories suggest. Now girls' reformatories tended to have fewer large-scale riots than boys' institutions, probably because girls were more heavily supervised, and because Victorian gender norms made physical rebellion more difficult for girls to organise and execute. But that does not mean girls were passive. They just found different ways to resist. There is evidence throughout reformatory records of what Victorian superintendents called hysterical outbursts. We talked about this earlier, in the context of trauma responses, but some historians now argue that at least some of these outbursts were tactical rather than psychological. A girl who screamed and cried and threw things disrupted the institution's precious order. She forced staff to pay attention to her. She made everyone else uncomfortable. And in a system designed to make girls invisible and compliant, being loud and disruptive was itself an act of resistance. There are cases where multiple girls would have hysterical episodes simultaneously, which does not sound like individual psychological breakdown so much as coordinated action. We all break down at the same time, forcing staff to deal with all of us, overwhelming their capacity to isolate and punish individual resistors. Was this intentional? We cannot know for Reardon because the girls left no written accounts explaining their strategies. But the pattern is suggestive. And then there were the quieter forms of resistance that happened every single day. Girls who moved slowly, dragging out simple tasks, girls who accidentally broke equipment or spilled things, girls who pretended not to understand instructions, forcing staff to repeat themselves over and over, girls who stole food from the kitchens or smuggled forbidden items into the dormitories. One of my favourite stories from the Red Lodge archives involves the geography lesson incident that we mentioned and briefly before. Let me give you more details because it is delightful. The girls were learning about longitude and latitude, basic navigation concepts. And during their supervised recreation time, a group of girls gathered around a map and started using their new knowledge to locate islands. They found one. We do not know which island. The records just say an island in the Southern Ocean. And they started talking about it, imagining it, creating elaborate stories about sailing there and starting a new life where they would be free. Staff reported this as concerning behaviour showing a refusal to accept their situation. The girls were punished. The map was taken away. Future geography lessons were more carefully monitored to make sure girls learned the content without developing dangerous ideas about freedom and escape. But the fact that they did it, that even under constant surveillance these girls found a way to dream together, to imagine freedom, to use the very education the institution provided as a tool for mental resistance, that tells you everything about the indomitable nature of the human spirit. The girls were not supposed to think about islands and freedom. They were supposed to focus on being good servants, on accepting their place, on being grateful for their salvation. But they looked at a map and saw a possibility. They learned about navigation and immediately thought, how do we navigate away from here? There is also evidence of girls maintaining social hierarchies and alliances that had nothing to do with the institution's reward system. Victorian reformers wanted girls to compete for marks and privileges, to be individualized and isolated from each other. But girls created their own underground social structure. There were leaders and followers. There were girls who protected younger or weaker girls. There were feuds and friendships that superseded anything staff tried to impose. And this social world was largely invisible to staff unless it erupted into visible conflict. When girls fought each other, staff saw it as evidence of their poor moral character, their tendency toward violence, but some of those fights were probably about maintaining or challenging positions within the girls' own social hierarchy. Some of those fights were communication in a context where honest communication was forbidden. And there were girls who used the system against itself. Girls who figured out exactly what they needed to do to earn marks and privileges, who performed perfect compliance while harbouring secret resistance. Girls who learned to manipulate staff, to play on their expectations and prejudices. Mary Carpenter occasionally notes in her journals that a girl she had thought was reformed turned out to be deceiving them all along. The girl had been accumulating marks, behaving perfectly, showing all the signs of moral improvement, and then, right before release or sometimes after release, it became clear that none of it had been real. The girl had just been playing the game, telling staff what they wanted to hear while maintaining her own sense of self underneath. Mary saw this as evidence of deep moral corruption. The girl was not just bad, she was manipulative. But you could also see it as evidence of intelligence and agency. The girl assessed her situation, figured out what performance was required to minimize punishment and maximize comfort, and delivered that performance while protecting her inner life from institutional control. Is that moral corruption, or is that survival? There is a documented case from an industrial school in the 1890s, not Red Lodge, but a similar institution, where a girl named Margaret kept a secret journal. This was forbidden. Girls were not supposed to have private writings that staff could not inspect. But Margaret hid scraps of paper and wrote on them with a pencil stub she had smuggled somehow. Her journal was eventually discovered during a room search. Staff confiscated it and read it aloud during a disciplinary meeting as evidence of Margaret's continued wickedness. And what was in this forbidden journal? Not confessions of criminal intent, not plans to escape or hurt anyone, just thoughts, feelings, observations about life in the institution, poems she had written, dreams about the future. The journal was destroyed. Margaret was severely punished, because even her private thoughts were not allowed to be private if they were not properly reformed thoughts. But Margaret had created that journal. For months she had maintained a secret inner life documented on hidden scraps of paper. That is resistance. That is refusing to be entirely consumed by the institution. And here is something that might surprise you. Staff were not always united against the girls. There were staff members who sympathised with the children, who questioned the methods, who tried to be kind within the constraints of the system. Frances Power Cobb, who worked at Red Lodge and lived with Mary Carpenter for a year, eventually left because she could not reconcile her beliefs with the institution's practices. She went on to become a prominent anti-vivisectionist and feminist, and later in life she wrote critically about her time at Red Lodge, though she tried to be respectful of Mary Carpenter's memory. But Cobb was not the only staff member who struggled. There are hints in various records of staff members being fired or quitting because they refused to implement harsh punishments, or because they grew too attached to the children, or because they simply could not stomach what they were being asked to do. The system required staff to be disciplinarians, to prioritise institutional order over individual children's needs, and some people just could not do it. Their departure was itself a form of resistance to the system, even if they did not frame it that way. So when we talk about resistance in reformatory schools, we are talking about a spectrum, from Hannah singing her street songs and refusing to be subdued, from 60 boys escaping Whitwick with stolen knives, from girls dreaming about islands on maps, from Margaret keeping her secret journal, from staff members who quit rather than continue hurting children. All of it was resistance to a system that claimed to be about love and salvation, but was actually about control and conformity. And the fact that resistance happened constantly, that it required constant vigilance and punishment to suppress, that it never fully stopped no matter how harsh the discipline became, that tells us that the system was built on force, not on the genuine reform it claimed to produce. So what happened when these resistant, defiant, unbroken girls aged out and were released back into the world? What happened when the girls who'd been successfully broken, who had internalized all the lessons, returned to lives of poverty and limited opportunity? Did the system consider them successes or failures? And by whose standards should we measure the outcomes? That is what we need to explore as we move toward the end of this story, because the question of whether reformatory schools worked depends entirely on what you think they were supposed to accomplish. Imagine you are 15 years old and you're standing at the gates of Red Lodge with a small bundle containing everything you own. You have spent the last 4 years locked inside that building, your days regimented down to the minute, your body and mind shaped by discipline and labour and constant surveillance. And now they are releasing you, back into the world, back into the same poverty you came from, except now you're 4 years older, and the only skill you have is washing other people's clothes. What happens next? This is the question that determines whether reformatory schools were actually about reform, or just about punishment dressed up in the language of salvation. Because if these institutions genuinely helped girls build better lives, then maybe, we could say the suffering had some purpose. But if girls left reformatories and ended up right back where they started, or worse, then what was the point of it all? The Victorian reformers had very specific ideas about what success looked like. If a girl left the reformatory and found employment in domestic service, kept that position for at least a year, stayed out of trouble with the law, and ideally got married to a respectable working-class man, that was success. The institution could mark her down as reformed, saved, proof that the system worked. If a girl left and within months was arrested again for theft or prostitution or vagrancy, that was failure. Evidence that she was one of the truly incorrigible cases, irredeemably wicked, beyond the reach of even the most dedicated reform efforts. But here is what is fascinating. When you actually look at the numbers, the statistics are not what you might expect. There was a comprehensive study done by historians who tracked thousands of children who went through reformatory and industrial schools in the Victorian and Edwardian periods. They followed these children through census records, criminal records, marriage records, death records, basically constructing life histories from fragmentary documentary evidence. And what they found was that the average reconviction rates for children who'd been institutionalized were actually quite low. Taking the whole of their lives into consideration, only 22% of children who had been in reformatories and industrial schools committed crimes in their adult lives following release. 22%, and only 2% committed more than one crime after release. Those numbers are startling, especially when you compare them to modern juvenile justice systems. Today, in England and Wales, 40% of juvenile offenders reoffend within just the first 12 months of release from custody, 40% in 1 year, versus 22% over an entire lifetime. So does that mean Victorian reformatory schools were wildly successful? Does that mean all the harsh discipline and unpaid labour and punishment cells actually worked? Well, hold on. Let us dig deeper, because numbers can be misleading. First, we need to consider what crimes Victorian children were being institutionalised for in the first place. Most of them, the vast majority, were locked up for poverty crimes, stealing food, being homeless, minor thefts of items worth pennies. These were not hardened criminals, these were desperate children committing survival crimes. So when we say only 22% reoffended, what we are really saying is that 78% of children who were never serious criminals in the first place did not become criminals as adults, which is probably what would have happened anyway if society had just addressed their poverty instead of imprisoning them. Second, we need to think about what counted as success by Victorian standards. Remember that girl JT from Liverpool we talked about earlier? The one who was placed in a brutal lodging house position and ran away within 6 months? The system marked her as a failure. But what if she ran away and found a different job somewhere else and managed to survive and build a decent life? The system would never know. They would just have her down in the books as reoffended based on that one arrest after she ran away. The tracking was imperfect. If a girl moved to a different city, changed her name through marriage, or just disappeared into the vast anonymity of the urban poor, the reformatory school lost track of her. So the success statistics are based only on the girls they could follow, which was probably biased toward those who stayed in the same area and maintained some connection to the institution. Third, and this is crucial, we need to ask, what were the alternatives? If these children had not gone to reformatory schools, what would have happened to them? Some would have died. The mortality rate among poor street children in Victorian cities was horrific. Malnutrition, disease, exposure, industrial accidents, violence. Childhood was genuinely dangerous for the poorest children. So yes, reformatory schools provided food and shelter and medical care that kept children alive who might otherwise have perished. But that does not mean reformatory schools were the only possible solution or the best solution. What if society had invested in poverty relief instead? What if there had been programs to help struggling families rather than taking children away from them? What if there had been genuine education and job training that prepared children for decent work rather than just domestic servitude? We cannot run that experiment in reverse, but we can look at what happened to the children who did leave reformatories and try to understand the complexity of their outcomes. Let me tell you about William Brown. because his case is documented in detail and it illustrates how complicated success can be. In 1896, 8-year-old William Brown was found living in a house frequented by prostitutes. Nobody accused him of committing any crime. He was just a child in a bad situation, probably because he had nowhere else to go. But Victorian authorities decided he was at risk of moral corruption, so they sent him to Stockport Industrial School. William stayed there until he was 16, learning basic education and being trained for manual labour. When he was released, he enlisted as a band boy with the 21st Lancers, a position in a military band, which was actually a pretty decent opportunity for a working-class boy. The military provided food, shelter, training, and a sense of structure. But after just 1 year, William was discharged from the military. The records note that his character was recorded as very good by his regiment. So why was he discharged? The records do not say explicitly, but the timing suggests he might have been deemed too young or physically unsuitable for the work, or perhaps the band was being reorganized. So here is William Brown, pulled from a bad situation as a child, institutionalized for 8 years, given training, enlisted in what could have been a stable career, then discharged after a year through no apparent fault of his own. What happened to him after that? The records go silent. We do not know if he found other work, if he thrived, if he struggled, if he ended up back in poverty. Was William Brown a success story? The industrial school would probably say yes. He left the institution, found employment, had no criminal record. But from William's perspective, was his life better than it would have been if society had just helped his family stay together instead of institutionalizing him as a child? Here is another pattern that shows up repeatedly in the records. Girls who left reformatories and went straight into domestic service positions that had been arranged by the institution. And these placements varied wildly in quality. Some girls were placed with relatively kind employers in decent households where they learned additional skills, earned reasonable wages for the time, and had some stability. These girls might work as housemaids for several years, save some money, eventually marry and transition into running their own households. By Victorian standards, this was success. But other girls were placed with exploitative employers who worked them brutally hard, paid them almost nothing, and treated them as barely human. These girls might endure the situation for a while, then run away, then struggle to find other work because they had no references, then end up back on the streets doing whatever they could to survive. And the reformatory schools often had no idea which placements were which until it was too late. They would place a girl with an employer who seemed respectable on paper, then never follow up adequately to ensure the placement was actually working out. The aftercare system was supposed to address this. Reformatory and industrial schools were required by law to maintain contact with former residents for at least 3 years after release. They were supposed to write letters, conduct visits, provide support if the girl was struggling, and some institutions took this seriously. There are records of reformatory staff staying in touch with former students for years, even decades. Letters from adult women writing back to the institutions where they had been as children, updating staff on their lives, their marriages, their children. Some of these letters expressed genuine affection for the institution, referring to it as home, thanking staff for what they did. But other institutions barely bothered with aftercare beyond the legal minimum. They would send 1 or 2 perfunctory letters, get no response or a vague response, and mark the girl as lost contact in their records, out of sight, out of mind. There is a case from the Children's Society, an organisation that ran multiple industrial schools where researchers were able to access detailed case files tracking individual girls through their time in the institution and several years after release. These files are gold for historians because they provide the kind of granular detail that lets you see actual lives rather than just statistics. One file documents a girl named Elizabeth, real name preserved in this case, who entered an industrial school at age 10 after her mother died and her father was unable to care for her. Elizabeth spent 6 years in the institution, then was placed as a scullery maid in a middle-class household in London. The first year went well. The employer wrote to the industrial school reporting that Elizabeth was satisfactory and hard-working. But in the second year, problems emerged. Elizabeth was having conflicts with the other servants, the cook in particular. The employer wrote complaining that Elizabeth was too independent and did not show proper deference. The industrial school sent someone to mediate, to remind Elizabeth that she needed to be more submissive, more compliant. But Elizabeth apparently refused to change her behaviour. Within 3 months, she was dismissed from the position. Now here is where it gets interesting. Elizabeth found another position on her own, without the industrial school's help, working in a shop rather than in domestic service. The industrial school initially noted this with disapproval. Shops were considered less respectable than private households for young women, with more opportunity for moral corruption. But Elizabeth stayed in that shop position for 5 years. She learned retail skills. She was eventually promoted to a supervisory role. She married a shopkeeper, and the last entry in her file from 10 years after her release notes that she was running her own small shop with her husband. So was Elizabeth a success or a failure? The industrial school initially saw her as a problem, too independent, unwilling to accept her proper place as a servant. But by stepping outside the path the institution had planned for her, Elizabeth actually built a more independent, more prosperous life than she would have had in domestic service. The Victorian reformers probably would not have counted her as a full success because she did not stay in the placement they arranged. But by any reasonable standard, Elizabeth succeeded in building a stable, self-sufficient life. And this pattern shows up repeatedly. Girls who deviated from the prescribed path sometimes did better than girls who followed it exactly. Because the prescribed path was designed to keep working-class girls in subordinate positions, and girls who had enough spirit and intelligence to resist that prescription sometimes carved out better opportunities for themselves. But we also cannot ignore the darker outcome. There are cases of girls who left reformatories and ended up in prostitution anyway, or who died young from poverty-related causes, or who simply vanished from the records in ways that suggest they were struggling. There is a heartbreaking file from one institution documenting a girl who left at age 16, was placed in domestic service, ran away after 3 months, was found by police living rough on the streets, was arrested for solicitation, likely prostitution, and died in custody at age 17 from what the records describe as fever, which could have been anything from typhoid to pneumonia to infection. The institution marked her down as one of their failures. But reading that file, you have to ask, what failed her? Was it her character, or was it a system that took a desperate child, locked her up for years, trained her only to be a servant, placed her in a bad situation, provided no meaningful support when that placement failed, and then criminalized her for trying to survive? The question of success versus failure cannot be separated from the question of what we think children deserved. Victorian reformers measured success by compliance and conformity. Did the girl become a good servant, a modest woman, a respectable wife and mother? But maybe success should be measured by whether a child was able to build a life they found meaningful, whether they had agency over their own destiny, whether they were treated with dignity and given genuine opportunities. By that standard, the reformatory system failed a lot more girls than the statistics suggest. And what about the girls who did maintain connections with the institutions where they had been imprisoned? The ones who wrote letters back, who visited, who seemed to view their time there with some affection? Were they genuinely grateful, Or had they internalized the narrative that they needed to be saved? Some letters are genuinely warm, expressing appreciation for being taught skills or kept safe. Other letters read more ambiguously, performing gratitude in ways that might have been strategic, maintaining a connection to the institution as a form of insurance in case they needed help in the future. And we have to remember, these are the letters that survived in institutional archives. Letters that expressed criticism or resentment were less likely to be preserved. So the historical record is biased toward positive accounts. What we are left with is a deeply mixed picture. Some children genuinely benefited from the structure and care they received in reformatory schools. Some children were irreparably harmed. Most were probably somewhere in between, traumatized by the experience but also given some resources they would not otherwise have had, angry about their imprisonment, but also aware that they might have died on the streets. The Victorian reformatory system was better than throwing children into adult prisons. It was better than letting them starve on the streets. But those were not the only options. Society could have chosen to address poverty directly, to support families, to create genuine opportunities for poor children without locking them up and exploiting their labour. So did reformatory schools work? It depends on what you think they were supposed to do. And understanding that question brings us to our final section, where we need to look at how this system finally ended, what replaced it, and what lessons, if any, we learned from this chapter of history. Because the story of how Victorian reformatories transformed into modern juvenile justice systems reveals a lot about whether we actually progressed or just changed the packaging on the same fundamental problems. The end came gradually, and then suddenly, the way institutional change often does. For decades, the Victorian reformatory system limped along, criticised by some, defended by others, but deeply entrenched in British society. And then, in the early 20th century, a series of reforms began to dismantle the structure that Mary Carpenter and her contemporaries had built. The beginning of the end can be traced to 1908, with the passage of what was called the Children's Charter, the Children and Young Persons Act. This legislation represented a major shift in how British society thought about juvenile justice. For the first time, the law explicitly recognised that children were different from adults and required different treatment not just in theory but in systematic practice. The Act introduced juvenile courts separate from adult courts. It established probation as an alternative to institutionalization. It set limits on when and how children could be imprisoned. And crucially, it started to merge the distinction between reformatory schools for convicted juveniles and industrial schools for children needing protection. The Act recognized that both groups of children had fundamentally the same needs, regardless of whether they'd been formally convicted of crimes. This merger process took time, but by 1927, the two types of schools officially adopted the common name approved schools. And this was not just a semantic change, it represented a philosophical shift. The emphasis was moving, at least on paper, from punishment and moral reformation toward education and rehabilitation appropriate for 20th century children. The Children and Young Persons Act of 1933 formalised this transformation. The Victorian industrial and reformatory school system was officially ended. The remaining institutions were reconstituted as approved schools, with objectives more aligned with modern understandings of child development and welfare. But here is the question we need to ask. Did things actually get better for the children? Or did society just rebrand the same basic approach with more progressive language? The honest answer is, it was complicated. Some things improved. Approved schools generally had better educational standards than their Victorian predecessors. Corporal punishment, while not eliminated, was more restricted and regulated. Staff received more training. Inspection was more rigorous. The philosophy shifted away from the religious moral framework that had dominated Victorian reform toward more secular approaches focused on psychology and social work. But the fundamental model remained similar. Take children from dysfunctional or criminal backgrounds, remove them from their communities, place them in institutional settings, subject them to regimented routines, and train them for working-class occupations. The packaging changed more than the contents. Approved schools operated in Britain until 1969, when they were finally replaced by a new system of community homes and more emphasis on keeping children in their families and communities whenever possible. But even that transition was messy, and many of the same institutions continued operating under new names. Meanwhile, Red Lodge itself had closed much earlier. In 1918, following a decline in the number of girls being placed there, the decision was made to shut down the reformatory. The closure coincided with the retirement of two sisters, the Langabeer sisters, who had both worked at Red Lodge for almost 40 years. 40 years! Imagine dedicating your entire adult life to an institution designed to reform working-class girls. What did they think at the end about all those years? About all those children who'd passed through? Did they feel they'd made a difference? Did they have doubts? The records do not tell us their private thoughts, only that they retired and the institution closed. After the closure, Red Lodge, the building, had an uncertain future. It was owned by Dr. Estlin Carpenter, Mary Carpenter's nephew. And for a time it looked like the property might be sold to developers who would gut the historic interior and turn it into modern apartments or offices. All that history, all those memories embedded in those oak-panelled walls and stone basement cells, nearly destroyed for profit. But a man named James Fuller Eberly, a private citizen who cared about Bristol's history, purchased the property and worked to transfer it into public care. Since 1948, Red Lodge has been a museum managed by Bristol City Council. You can visit it today. Walk through those same rooms where girls once slept in rows of narrow beds. See the great oak room where they prayed. Stand in the basement where the punishment cells still exist, silent witnesses to suffering. The museum does not shy away from the darker aspects of the building's history. There are displays about Mary Carpenter's reformatory, about the girls who lived there, about the contradictions between the rhetoric of love and the reality of control. It's one of the more honest historical sites I have encountered, willing to acknowledge complexity rather than presenting a sanitized heroic narrative. And Mary Carpenter herself, she died in June of 1877 at Red Lodge, in her sleep. She was 70 years old. Her funeral was extraordinary, a procession half a mile long. Thousands of people lined the streets of Bristol to pay their respects. Between 60 and 100 children from each of the institutions she had founded marched in their respective uniforms. Red Lodge Reformatory, Kingswood Reformatory, the Boys' Industrial School, Park Row Industrial School. Can you imagine being one of those children marching in formation at the funeral of the woman who had shaped your entire adolescence? What were they thinking? Were they genuinely mourning? Were they relieved she was gone? Were they just performing the expected role as they had been trained to do? A public meeting was held to raise money for a memorial. They raised £2,700, a huge sum for 1877, which was split between supporting her institutions and creating a memorial in Bristol Cathedral. That memorial still exists. Mary Carpenter is remembered as a pioneer of juvenile reform, a woman who dedicated her life to children nobody else cared about. And that is true. It is also true that her methods caused harm. Both things can be true simultaneously. Mary Carpenter's influence extended far beyond Bristol. Her writings were translated into multiple languages. Reformers in Europe, India, and America studied her work and adapted her ideas. She travelled internationally, visiting schools and prisons, advocating for reform. In India, she worked to improve conditions in prisons and establish schools for girls, bringing her particular brand of reform to British colonial contexts. So her legacy is massive. The modern systems of juvenile justice, probation, aftercare, all of these have roots in the reforms that Mary Carpenter and her contemporaries championed. The idea that children are different from adults, that they can change, that society has a responsibility to provide education and opportunities rather than just punishment. These principles that seem obvious to us now were revolutionary in the early 19th century, but we also have to acknowledge the harm. The children who were traumatized, the girls whose labor was exploited, the racist and classist structures that the system reinforced, the sexual control and body surveillance, the punishment cells and isolation and breaking of spirits. History is not simple. People are not simple. Systems are not simple. So what lessons can we learn from the Victorian Reformatory School? What does this history teach us about our own approaches to troubled youth? First, good intentions are not enough. Mary Carpenter genuinely wanted to help children, but her methods caused harm because they were based on assumptions about class and gender and morality that prioritized social control over individual well-being. We need to constantly interrogate our own assumptions about marginalized populations and ask whether our help is actually helpful or just another form of control. Second, institutionalization should be an absolute last resort. The Victorian reformatory system was built on removing children from their communities and families. Modern research overwhelmingly shows that keeping children connected to supportive relationships and familiar environments produces better outcomes than isolation. When we do institutionalize young people, we need to ensure it is truly necessary and truly beneficial, not just convenient for society. Third, poverty is not a crime. The vast majority of children in Victorian reformatories were there because they were poor, not because they were inherently criminal or immoral. If we addressed economic inequality, housing instability, food insecurity, and lack of educational opportunity, we would prevent far more youth crime than any amount of incarceration ever could. Fourth, labour exploitation is still exploitation even when it is framed as training. Any system that profits from unpaid youth labour while claiming to help those youths is suspect. We need to be vigilant about work programs, vocational training and institutional labour to ensure young people are genuinely learning valuable skills and not just being used as free workers. Fifth, resistance is meaningful. The girls who fought back, who maintained their sense of self, despite everything the system tried to do to them, they were not moral failures. They were human beings asserting their dignity and agency. When young people in our current systems resist, we should ask what they are resisting and whether their resistance might be justified. And finally, the past is not past. The Victorian reformatory system officially ended, but its DNA lives on in modern juvenile detention centres, in boot camps for troubled teens, in residential treatment facilities. The same tensions between care and control, between help and punishment, between protection and confinement, these still exist. Today, right now, there are young people locked in institutions that claim to be helping them. Some of those institutions are genuinely doing good work. Some are repeating the mistakes of the Victorian reformatories under new names. And it is our responsibility to pay attention, to ask hard questions, to demand that systems actually serve the well-being of young people rather than the convenience of society. The reconviction rate comparison I mentioned earlier, Victorian children reoffending at 22% over their lifetimes versus modern youth reoffending at 40% in just 12 months, that should trouble us deeply. Not because Victorian methods were better, but because it suggests we have not actually figured this out yet. We have not found the right balance between accountability and compassion, between protecting society and nurturing young people, between intervention and overreach. Maybe the lesson is that there is no perfect system. Maybe the best we can do is remain humble about our limitations, stay curious about what actually works, listen to the voices of the young people themselves, and keep trying to do better. The girls of Red Lodge cannot speak to us directly. Most of them left no written records. Their voices were silenced by a society that did not consider them important enough to document fully. But their resistance speaks, their survival speaks. The very fact that the system had to work so hard to control them tells us they were never broken, never fully defeated, never reduced to the compliant servants Victorian society wanted them to be. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all. The human spirit is remarkably resilient. Even in the worst circumstances, even under the most oppressive systems, even when everything is designed to break you down and remake you into something else, there is something in us that resists, that maintains a core sense of self, that refuses to be entirely consumed. The Victorian girls sent away for re-education were not saved by the reformatory system. Some of them were saved despite it. They survived, they adapted, they found ways to live, and their stories, fragmentary and incomplete as they are, remind us that behind every policy, every institution, every reform movement, there are real human beings with real lives and real dignity that deserves respect. So as we close this chapter, as we step back from the stone walls of Red Lodge and the yellowed pages of Mary Carpenter's journals and the statistical tables tracking recidivism rates, let us remember the children. The girl who sang her street songs in defiance, the girl who kept a secret journal, the girl who dreamed about islands while studying maps, the girl who escaped with 60 boys and stolen knives, the girl who did her laundry poorly on purpose, the girl who survived and married a shopkeeper and ran her own business, the girl who did not survive and died at 17 in custody. All of them matter. All of their stories matter. And if we can hold the complexity of their experiences, the harm and the help, the trauma and the survival, the good intentions and the terrible consequences, maybe we can build systems that actually serve young people rather than simply controlling them. Thank you for taking this journey with me through this strange, troubling, complicated history. Thank you for listening with open hearts and curious minds. Thank you for being willing to sit with discomfort and ambiguity and the messy reality that history rarely offers clear heroes or villains, just flawed humans doing the best they could with the understanding they had. I hope this story has given you something to think about. Maybe it has changed how you see those beautiful old buildings in your own cities that might have darker histories. Maybe it has made you more curious about the young people in your own communities who are struggling with the justice system. Maybe it has just reminded you that history is always more complicated than we first think. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Victorian reformatory schools, please let me know in the comments. Tell me what surprised you, what troubled you, what you are still thinking about. And stay tuned, because there are so many more strange, fascinating and important stories from history that deserve to be told. Stories that can help us understand not just the past, but ourselves and the world we are still building. Until next time, sleep well, dream gently, and remember, every institution that claims to be saving people deserves careful, critical examination. Love without power to choose is not really love at all. Good night.